Tonight we journey into the extraordinary life of Stanford Philbrick Pines, the six-fingered genius whose insatiable curiosity opened doorways to realms beyond imagination. Born with an abnormality that would define his destiny, Ford's brilliant mind led him from the shores of glass-shard beach to the mysterious forests of Gravity Falls, where ancient secrets and interdimensional horrors awaited. Through journals filled with meticulous observations, we'll trace his path from celebrated researcher to paranoid recluse, from trusted friend to betrayed victim of cosmic manipulation. Settle in as we explore the complete chronicles of the man who documented the impossible and paid the ultimate price for forbidden knowledge. There exists in the annals of human experience a particular cruelty that befalls those born different, those whose very existence challenges the comfortable uniformity that society demands. Stanford Philbrick Pines entered this world in the late 1940s. During those post-war years, when America was rebuilding itself on dreams of normalcy and suburban perfection. Yet from his first breath, drawn in the salty air of Glass-Shard Beach, New Jersey, Ford carried with him a mark that would forever set him apart from the world he was meant to inhabit. Glass-Shard Beach was not the sort of place where extraordinary things were supposed to happen. It was a working-class community built on the bones of old fishing industry, where families like the Pines scraped together modest livings from modest enterprises. Philbrick Pines ran a pawn shop, one of those cluttered establishments where the detritus of broken dreams accumulated like sediment, each item telling its own story of hopes sold for immediate necessity. The shop bore the family name with weathered pride, Pines Pawn, its windows crowded with the accumulated mysteries of other people's lives. Here, amid the tangled jewelry, forgotten musical instruments, and obsolete electronics, Ford would spend his earliest years learning to see patterns where others saw only chaos. But it was not the pawn shop that would define Ford's early years so much as the relationship that began 15 minutes before his official birth, when his twin brother Stanley made his entrance into the world. Those 15 minutes would become a recurring theme in their relationship, a small but persistent reminder of precedence that Ford would never quite let Stanley forget. Yet despite this minor temporal advantage, the two boys were bound together by something far more profound than birth order, something that would sustain them through years of hardship and ultimately tear them apart in ways neither could imagine. Ford's polydactyly, the technical term for his six-fingered condition, manifested as a perfectly formed additional digit on each hand. These were not crude appendages or vestigial growths, but fully functional fingers that moved with the same dexterity as their five companions. In a different time, or perhaps a different culture, such a trait might have been seen as a blessing, a sign of special favor from the gods. But in 1950s America, in the blue-collar community of Glass-Shard Beach, six fingers marked Ford as definitively, inescapably different. The cruelty of children toward difference is well documented, but rarely is it examined with the depth it deserves. For Ford, the playground became a daily trial where his extraordinary feature was transformed into a source of shame. The pointed fingers, the whispered comments, the casual exclusion from games and activities, all served to reinforce the message that he was somehow fundamentally wrong. Yet within this crucible of social rejection, something remarkable was forged. Ford's six-fingered hands, the source of his otherness, became also the symbol of his exceptional nature. Where other children saw monstrosity, Ford began to see possibility. His additional fingers provided him with enhanced dexterity, allowing him to manipulate small objects with unprecedented precision. More importantly, they served as a constant reminder that he was not bound by the normal limitations that constrained his peers. If he could be born with six fingers in a five-fingered world, what other impossibilities might be within his reach? Stanley, by contrast, bore no such obvious marks of difference, yet he found himself equally marginalized by their peer group. Smaller than his brother, less academically gifted, more prone to impulsive behavior, Stanley occupied the uncomfortable position of being the normal twin in a pair where normality offered no protection from social rejection. The dynamic between the brothers during these early years established patterns that would persist throughout their lives. Ford as the brilliant outsider whose gifts came at the cost of belonging, and Stanley as the loyal protector whose love for his brother often required him to share in his exile. Their bond was forged in the crucible of shared otherness, strengthened by countless hours spent in each other's company when the outside world proved unwelcoming. Together, they explored the beaches and tide pools of their hometown, Ford documenting unusual shells and rock formations with scientific precision, while Stanley provided the adventurous spirit that transformed their expeditions into grand quests. It was during these explorations that they began to develop their shared dream, a vision of escape from the confining boundaries of Glassshard Beach aboard their own vessel of discovery. The Stan-O War, named with the casual arrogance of boys who saw no contradiction between their humble circumstances and their grandiose ambitions, began as a collection of salvaged boards and discarded maritime equipment. Ford approached the project with characteristic methodical precision, sketching detailed blueprints and calculating stress loads with mathematical formulas that would have impressed his teachers had they known of their existence. Stanley contributed the practical skills, the willingness to get his hands dirty, the intuitive understanding of how things fit together that no amount of theoretical knowledge could provide. Working side by side in the small workshop behind the pawn shop, the twins created something that transcended its humble materials. The boat became a symbol of their shared future, a physical manifestation of their determination to escape the limitations of their birth circumstances. Ford envisioned himself as a great explorer, documenting unknown species and mapping uncharted territories. Stanley saw himself as the adventurous captain, navigating by instinct and courage through whatever challenges they might encounter. Yet, even as they built their dreams board by board, the outside world continued to intrude upon their private paradise. The bullying intensified as they grew older, taking on the more sophisticated cruelties that adolescents perfect with disturbing efficiency. Krampelter, a boy whose own insecurities found expression through the systematic torment of those he perceived as weaker, became their primary tormentor. His approach was particularly insidious because it targeted not just Ford's physical difference, but the relationship between the twins themselves. "You're a six-fingered freak," he would say to Ford with casual malice, "and you're just a dumber, sweatier version of him," he would add, turning to Stanley. "You're lucky you have each other, because neither of you will ever make any friends." These words, delivered with the precision of someone who understood exactly where to apply pressure, struck at the heart of what made the twins vulnerable. They confirmed their isolation, while simultaneously suggesting that even their bond with each other was born of desperation rather than genuine affection. Philbrick Pines, witnessing his son's struggles with the impatience of a man who had little tolerance for weakness, responded in the manner typical of his generation and social class. Boxing lessons would toughen them up, teach them to stand up for themselves, transform them into the kind of boys who commanded respect rather than invited ridicule. The logic was simple, brutal, and fundamentally flawed. Physical strength might deter some forms of bullying, but it could not address the deeper issues that marked Ford as different, or Stanley as somehow insufficient. The boxing gym became another arena where the twins' differences were highlighted rather than resolved. Ford approached the sport with intellectual curiosity, studying the geometry of movement and the physics of impact, with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else. Stanley relied on instinct and emotional intensity, throwing himself into the training with desperate enthusiasm. Neither approach proved particularly effective at transforming them into the confident young men their father envisioned. But if the boxing lessons failed in their stated purpose, they succeeded in strengthening the bond between the twins. Sharing the experience of being pummeled by more athletic boys, supporting each other through the humiliation of repeated defeats, they developed an even deeper appreciation for their mutual dependence. They were partners in adversity, allies in a world that seemed determined to reject them both. As Ford entered his high school years, his academic gifts became increasingly apparent to his teachers, even as they remained invisible to his peer group. His scientific curiosity, fed by voracious reading and meticulous experimentation, began to manifest in projects that bordered on the revolutionary. While other students struggled with basic concepts, Ford was exploring advanced theories and developing original hypotheses that impressed even his most demanding instructors. The perpetual motion machine that would ultimately change both twins' lives forever began as Ford's attempt to solve one of physics' most enduring challenges. The laws of thermodynamics clearly stated that such a device was impossible, that energy could neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. Yet Ford approached the problem with the confidence of someone who had been defying natural laws simply by existing. If nature could produce a six-fingered boy in a five-fingered world, perhaps it could also produce a machine that violated its own supposedly inviolable principles. Working in the makeshift laboratory he had established in the basement of the family home, Ford assembled a device of breathtaking complexity and elegant design. Gears meshed with mathematical precision, weights balanced according to carefully calculated ratios, and the entire mechanism hummed with the promise of infinite energy. For weeks, the machine ran without any apparent external power source, its wheels turning with hypnotic regularity, seemingly mocking the fundamental laws that governed the universe. The science fair at Gravity Falls High School had never seen anything quite like Ford's perpetual motion machine. While other students displayed volcano models and plant growth experiments, Ford presented what appeared to be a genuine breakthrough in theoretical physics. The judges, initially skeptical, found themselves unable to explain how the device continued to operate without any visible energy input. Word spread quickly through the scientific community, reaching even the admissions officers at West Coast Tech, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the country. West Coast Tech represented everything Ford had dreamed of since childhood. It was a place where genius was not only accepted but celebrated, where six-fingered hands would be seen as assets rather than aberrations, where the impossible was simply another problem to be solved through rigorous application of scientific method. The university's graduates had gone on to transform science fiction into science fact, pioneering technologies that had reshaped the modern world. When the admissions team announced their intention to visit Gravity Falls High School to evaluate Ford's work personally, it seemed that all his years of struggle and isolation had finally led to this moment of validation. The principal's office had never hosted such distinguished visitors, and the excitement was palpable throughout the school. Ford spent days preparing his presentation, rehearsing explanations of the complex theories underlying his device, imagining the moment when he would be accepted into the ranks of the scientific elite. But Stanley, watching his brother's excitement with growing dread, saw not opportunity but catastrophe. The acceptance that Ford so desperately craved would mean separation, the end of their shared dreams, the dissolution of the partnership that had sustained them both through years of adversity. The Stano War sat unfinished in their workshop, a monument to abandoned dreams, while Ford's attention turned entirely toward his individual future. The night before the West Coast Tech evaluation, Stanley found himself alone with his thoughts and his fears in Ford's laboratory. The perpetual motion machine hummed with quiet efficiency, its gears turning with the inexorable certainty of fate itself. In his hand, Stanley held the remains of his evening snack, a toffee peanut whose wrapper bore silent witness to his presence in this space where he had never truly belonged. The machine that represented his brother's escape route sat before him, beautiful in its complexity, terrible in its implications. What happened next would be debated between the twins for decades, the source of resentment and guilt that would poison their relationship and ultimately tear them apart. Stanley would claim it was an accident, a moment of clumsiness, born of emotional distress. Ford would see it as sabotage, a deliberate act of betrayal, motivated by jealousy and selfishness. The truth, as is often the case in matters of family conflict, probably contained elements of both perspectives. The toffee peanut wrapper, sticky with residual candy coating, found its way into the delicate mechanisms of the perpetual motion machine. Perhaps Stanley dropped it accidentally while leaning over the device in contemplation. Perhaps he threw it in a moment of desperate rebellion against the forces that were pulling his brother away from him. The specific details matter less than the consequences. The wrapper adhered to one of the crucial gears, creating friction where none should exist, gradually slowing the machine's rotation until it ground to a halt. Stanley's attempts at repair, undertaken with desperate determination and woefully inadequate technical knowledge, only made the damage worse. By morning, what had been a marvel of engineering had become a collection of misaligned components and broken dreams. When the West Coast Tech evaluation team arrived, they found not a revolutionary breakthrough but a simple mechanical failure, a device that had promised to violate the laws of physics but had instead demonstrated their inviolable nature. A perpetual motion machine has one job, the lead evaluator observed with crushing finality, to not stop. The rejection was swift and absolute, decades of preparation dismissed in a single sentence. Ford's dreams of scientific glory evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind only the bitter taste of failure and the growing suspicion that his disappointment was not entirely accidental. The discovery of the toffee peanut wrapper amid the machine's broken components confirmed Ford's worst fears. Stanley's distinctive choice of candy, rarely consumed by anyone else in the household, served as an accusation more damning than any witness testimony. The confrontation that followed would echo through both their lives, its harsh words and mutual recriminations establishing patterns of blame and guilt that would persist for 30 years. "You ruined my life," Ford accused, his voice carrying all the pain of shattered dreams and betrayed trust. "You sabotaged my machine because you couldn't stand the thought of me succeeding without you." The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark with devastating precision. Stanley's response, born of equal parts guilt and defiance, only made matters worse. "It was supposed to be us forever," he protested, revealing the desperation that had motivated his actions. "You were going to leave me behind for some fancy college where I'd never fit in." His admission of jealousy, intended as explanation, was received as confirmation of intentional sabotage. But it was Philbrick Pine's reaction that transformed a family argument into a permanent rupture. Having overheard the confrontation, he emerged from the shadows with the cold fury of a man who saw his family's financial future disappearing before his eyes. The potential millions that Ford's genius might have earned, the social status that would have elevated the entire Pines family, all sacrificed on the altar of Stanley's selfishness. "Until you make this family the money that Stanford would have made us, you aren't welcome in this house," Philbrick declared, his words carrying the weight of final judgment. The banishment was swift and merciless. a 17-year-old boy cast out into a world that had never shown him much kindness, armed with nothing but his wits and his stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. Ford watched his brother gather his few possessions and disappear into the night, and though his anger burned bright and righteous in his chest, somewhere beneath it lay the cold knowledge that he had lost something irreplaceable. The Stano War sat unfinished in their workshop, its dreams of adventure abandoned like everything else they had once shared. Ford had gained his father's approval but lost his brother, traded partnership for isolation, exchanged shared dreams for solitary ambition. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the weight of choices made in moments of fear and pain, the way childhood wounds can shape the trajectory of entire lives. Ford's six-fingered hands, once symbols of his otherness, would soon become instruments of discovery and creation, tools for unlocking secrets that no five-fingered person could grasp. But they would also serve as reminders of the price paid for achievement, the brother sacrificed on the altar of individual success, the partnership dissolved in a moment of mutual betrayal that neither could forgive or forget. There exists a peculiar alchemy that transforms rejection into determination, failure into fuel for future achievement. Stanford Pines, cast from the familiar shores of glass-shard beach into an uncertain academic future, discovered that even the most devastating setbacks could become foundations for greater accomplishments. The rejection from West Coast Tech, that crushing moment when his dreams of scientific glory crumbled before his eyes, served not to break his spirit, but to forge it into something more resilient and adaptable than he had ever imagined possible. Backup-Small University was everything that West Coast Tech was not. Where the prestigious institution gleamed with cutting-edge facilities and world-renowned faculty, Backup-Small offered modest buildings, limited resources, and professors who had chosen teaching over research excellence. It was, by every conventional measure, a backup plan, a consolation prize for students whose primary ambitions had been thwarted by circumstance or inadequate preparation. Yet for Ford, arriving on campus with the bitter taste of rejection still fresh in his memory, Backup-Small represented something far more valuable than prestige. It offered him the opportunity to be extraordinary in a place where extraordinary was desperately needed. The scholarship that brought Ford to Backup-Small was merit-based but hardly generous, covering tuition and basic expenses while leaving him to find his own way through the complex landscape of higher education. His dormitory room was Spartan, furnished with the kind of institutional furniture that prioritized durability over comfort. His roommate was a pleasant but unremarkable young man from Connecticut who majored in business administration and harbored dreams of suburban prosperity that Ford found both admirable and utterly foreign to his own ambitions. But if Ford's living situation was humble, his academic opportunities were limited only by his imagination and determination. Backup-Small's professors, perhaps starved for students who displayed genuine intellectual curiosity, welcomed Ford's penetrating questions and innovative approaches with enthusiasm that bordered on relief. Here, finally, was a student who didn't merely seek to memorize information for regurgitation on examinations, but who wanted to understand the underlying principles that governed natural phenomena. Ford's academic performance at Backup-Small was nothing short of remarkable. While his classmates struggled with introductory concepts, he was already pushing into advanced theoretical territory, proposing modifications to established theories and conducting independent research that impressed even his most demanding instructors. His six-fingered hands, once a source of childhood shame, became instruments of unprecedented dexterity in laboratory work, allowing him to manipulate delicate equipment with precision that amazed his professors and fellow students alike. It was during his second semester at Backups that Ford encountered the person who would become not just his closest friend, but his most trusted collaborator in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. Fiddleford Hadron McGucket arrived at the university like a force of nature, a whirlwind of mechanical genius and folksy enthusiasm who possessed an intuitive understanding of how things worked that complemented Ford's theoretical brilliance perfectly. Where Ford saw equations and principles, McGucket saw gears and circuits. Where Ford calculated stress loads and thermodynamic efficiency, McGucket built machines that simply worked, often in ways that defied conventional engineering wisdom. McGucket's appearance was as distinctive as his mechanical aptitude. His hair seemed to exist in a constant state of dishevelment, as if he had recently received an electrical shock or emerged from a wind tunnel. His clothing bore the permanent stains of machine oil and solder flux, evidence of countless hours spent bent over workbenches and engine compartments. His hands, scarred by minor mishaps with tools and machinery, moved with the confident precision of someone who had been building and repairing things since childhood. But it was McGucket's mind that truly set him apart from his peers. Behind his aw-shucks demeanor and mountain accent lay an intelligence every bit as formidable as Ford's own. He could visualize complex mechanical systems in 3 dimensions, mentally rotating and disassembling them to understand their function and identify potential improvements. He spoke of machines as if they were old friends, attributing personalities and moods to devices that others saw merely as collections of inanimate components. The friendship between Ford and McGucket developed with the easy naturalness of 2 people who recognized in each other a kindred spirit. Their first meeting occurred in the university's engineering laboratory, where Ford was attempting to construct a device for measuring electromagnetic field fluctuations. His theoretical knowledge was impeccable, but his practical skills were limited by lack of experience with sophisticated machinery. McGucket, observing Ford's struggles with generous amusement, offered assistance that quickly transformed into collaboration. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," McGucket observed, examining Ford's design specifications with admiration. "That's about the most elegant piece of theoretical work I've seen since I've been at this here university. But if you don't mind me saying so, your wiring diagram looks like it was designed by a raccoon with a fever." Ford's initial reaction to this criticism was defensive indignation, but McGucket's obvious expertise and genuine desire to help quickly overcame his wounded pride. Working together, they redesigned the device from the ground up, Ford contributing the theoretical framework while McGucket handled the practical implementation. The result was not only functional but innovative, incorporating design elements that neither could have conceived independently. Their collaboration extended far beyond individual projects into a comprehensive partnership that enhanced both their academic achievements. Ford's natural inclination towards systematic research was perfectly complemented by McGucket's ability to transform theoretical concepts into working prototypes. Together, they tackled problems that would have been impossible for either to solve alone, producing work that caught the attention of the scientific community well beyond the modest confines of Backups University. The academic recognition that followed their joint research efforts was unprecedented in Backups history. Their papers on electromagnetic anomaly detection were published in respected scientific journals. Their experimental techniques were cited by researchers at far more prestigious institutions, and their innovations began to attract the attention of government agencies interested in their potential applications. Ford found himself receiving invitations to present his work at conferences where he was often the youngest participant by decades. But perhaps the most significant recognition came in the form of a substantial cash prize awarded for their breakthrough work in anomaly detection technology. The prize ceremony, held at a prestigious scientific institution, marked Ford's first taste of the kind of recognition he had dreamed of since childhood. Standing at the podium, accepting congratulations from distinguished scientists whose names he had read in textbooks, Ford experienced a moment of pure triumph that seemed to justify all the struggles and disappointments of his earlier years. The prize money, substantial by the standards of struggling students, provided Ford with something he had never possessed before: financial independence and the freedom to pursue research according to his own interests, rather than the requirements of academic assignments. It also planted the seed of an idea that would eventually transform his life in ways he could never have anticipated. Ford's fascination with anomalies had been growing throughout his academic career, but the success of his anomaly detection research crystallized this interest into something approaching obsession. The universe, he had come to understand, was not the orderly and predictable system that most people imagined. Instead, it was filled with statistical improbabilities, phenomena that occurred far more or less frequently than mathematical models suggested they should. These anomalies, dismissed by most scientists as experimental error or measurement uncertainty, represented to Ford something far more intriguing: evidence that the fundamental laws of nature might not be as inviolable as commonly believed. His six-fingered hands, that mark of biological anomaly that had defined so much of his early life, became the focal point of a broader theory about the nature of statistical deviation. If nature could produce a perfectly functional human being with 6 fingers instead of 5, what other impossibilities might it routinely generate? What patterns might emerge if someone took the time to catalogue and study these deviations systematically? The more Ford researched anomalies, the more convinced he became that they were not random occurrences but followed patterns that could be mapped and understood. His analysis of historical records, scientific literature, and folklore from around the world revealed tantalizing suggestions that certain geographical locations seemed to attract or generate anomalous phenomena with unusual frequency. Legends of miraculous healings, reports of impossible creatures, accounts of objects behaving in ways that violated known physical laws, all clustered around specific regions with statistical significance that could not be dismissed as coincidence. One location in particular captured Ford's attention with almost magnetic intensity: Gravity Falls, Oregon, a small lumber town in Roadkill County, appeared in an unusually high number of anomaly reports dating back to the earliest European settlement of the region. Native American legends spoke of the area as a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, where spirits and monsters roamed freely among the towering pine forests. Pioneer accounts described encounters with creatures that defied classification, phenomena that challenged rational explanation, and a general sense of otherworldly presence that permeated the entire region. Modern reports, carefully cross-referenced against official records and witness testimony, painted an even more compelling picture. Gravity Falls experienced statistical anomalies in everything from wildlife behavior to electromagnetic readings, from geological formations to meteorological patterns. The town's residents, perhaps grown accustomed to the unusual through generations of exposure, seemed to accept these oddities with remarkable equanimity, dismissing them as local color or tourist attractions rather than subjects worthy of serious scientific investigation. For Ford, this dismissive attitude represented an unprecedented opportunity. Here was a location where anomalous phenomena occurred with documented frequency, where the local population would likely welcome rather than obstruct scientific investigation, and where he could conduct the kind of comprehensive research that had never been attempted before. The prize money from his electromagnetic work, combined with a generous research grant that his academic achievements had made possible, provided him with the financial resources to establish an independent research facility and pursue his investigations without the constraints of institutional oversight. The decision to relocate to Gravity Falls was not made lightly. It meant leaving behind the academic community where he had finally found acceptance, abandoning the comfort of established relationships and familiar routines, and venturing into unknown territory both literally and figuratively. McGucket, while supportive of Ford's ambitions, was unable to accompany him immediately due to his own academic commitments and family obligations. For the first time since his banishment from his childhood home, Ford would be truly alone. The journey to Oregon was both practical necessity and symbolic transition, a physical movement that reflected Ford's evolution from student to independent researcher. His belongings, packed with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to modest possessions, included scientific equipment that represented the accumulated tools of his academic career. Books on theoretical physics shared space with precision instruments. Notebooks filled with calculations traveled alongside specimen containers, designed for unknown discoveries. Gravity Falls in person proved even more intriguing than Ford's research had suggested. The town nestled among towering conifers with an almost fairy tale quality, its buildings constructed in the rustic style that spoke of logging heritage and small community values. The residents, as predicted, welcomed the arrival of a university-educated researcher with polite curiosity rather than suspicion, viewing his scientific interests as potentially beneficial to local tourism and economic development. But it was the phenomena themselves that truly captivated Ford's attention from his first days in the town. Walking the forest paths, he encountered evidence of anomalous activity that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. Electromagnetic readings fluctuated wildly in certain areas, defying explanation through conventional geological or meteorological theories. Plant growth patterns displayed characteristics that seemed to violate established principles of botanical development. Animal behavior deviated from documented norms in ways that suggested the influence of unknown environmental factors. Ford's establishment of his research laboratory represented the culmination of years of preparation and the beginning of what he hoped would be his life's greatest work. The facility, constructed with meticulous attention to both scientific functionality and security requirements, incorporated the most advanced equipment available within his budget constraints. Precision instruments capable of detecting minute variations in electromagnetic fields, gravitational measurements, and temporal flow were installed alongside more conventional research tools. The laboratory's design reflected Ford's understanding that some of his discoveries might prove dangerous if mishandled. Containment protocols were established for specimens that exhibited unusual properties. Isolation chambers were constructed for experiments that might produce unpredictable results, and emergency procedures were developed for scenarios that conventional scientific training had never addressed. Perhaps the most significant feature of Ford's research facility was the underground bunker that he constructed beneath the main laboratory. This hidden chamber, accessible only through concealed entrances and protected by multiple security systems, was designed to house the most dangerous and valuable discoveries of his research. The bunker's construction required months of careful excavation and reinforcement, work that Ford undertook personally to maintain secrecy about its existence and purpose. The first journal that Ford began keeping upon his arrival in Gravity Falls bore the symbol that would become his signature, a six-fingered hand pressed against the cover in gold leaf. This emblem represented not merely his physical uniqueness, but his philosophical approach to the research ahead, just as his extra digit allowed him to manipulate objects in ways that five-fingered individuals could not. His unique perspective, as someone born outside normal parameters, might enable him to perceive and understand phenomena that conventional scientists would miss or dismiss. The journal entries from Ford's early months in Gravity Falls reveal a mind operating at the peak of its powers, systematically cataloguing discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Detailed sketches, accompanied by precise measurements, documented creatures that seemed to blend characteristics of known species in impossible combinations. Photographs captured objects that appeared to violate basic physical laws, their very existence raising questions about the completeness of current scientific understanding. Each discovery led to new questions. Each answer revealed additional mysteries, and gradually Ford found himself drawn deeper into a web of interconnected phenomena that seemed to point towards some underlying truth about the nature of existence itself. His research days extended into nights, his careful documentation expanded into multiple volumes, and his initial excitement evolved into something approaching obsession. By the time Ford completed his first journal and began the second, he had documented dozens of anomalous species, mapped several locations where reality seemed particularly unstable, and developed preliminary theories about the mechanisms that might be responsible for Gravity Falls' unique characteristics. His work was progressing at a pace that exceeded his most optimistic projections, yet the central question that had brought him to Oregon remained frustratingly unanswered. The completion of his second journal and the beginning of his third marked a crucial transition in Ford's research. The accumulated weight of evidence had convinced him that Gravity Falls anomalies were not random occurrences, but manifestations of some deeper phenomenon that conventional science was unprepared to address. His documentation had evolved from simple cataloging to theoretical analysis, from description to explanation, from research to revelation. Yet, even as his understanding deepened, Ford found himself increasingly isolated from the normal world of human interaction. His research consumed more and more of his time and attention. His social connections dwindled to occasional interactions with townspeople who regarded him with friendly but distant curiosity, and his communication with the outside scientific community became sporadic and eventually ceased altogether. The third journal, begun with the confidence of someone who believed himself on the verge of breakthrough discoveries, would eventually become the record of Ford's descent into territory that no human mind was prepared to navigate. The careful scientific methodology that had characterized his earlier work would give way to desperate attempts to understand forces that operated beyond the boundaries of rational comprehension. The systematic documentation that had marked his academic career would be replaced by increasingly frantic entries describing encounters with intelligences that challenged the very foundations of human understanding. But as Ford filled page after page of his third journal, documenting phenomena that grew progressively more disturbing and inexplicable, he remained convinced that he was approaching answers to the fundamental questions that had driven his research. Somewhere in the accumulated evidence lay the key to understanding not just Gravity Falls mysteries, but the deeper nature of reality itself. The price of that understanding would prove to be higher than he could have imagined. But the scholar's path, once begun, allows for no retreat from knowledge, regardless of the consequences that knowledge might bring. As sleep settles over your consciousness tonight, rest in the knowledge that curiosity, even when it leads into dangerous territory, represents one of humanity's most noble impulses. Ford's journey from rejected student to isolated researcher reflects the eternal tension between the safety of ignorance and the perilous beauty of understanding. His six-fingered hands, once symbols of childhood shame, had become instruments of discovery that would unlock secrets beyond imagination, though the cost of those secrets would test the very limits of human resilience and sanity. There exists in the pursuit of knowledge a moment when curiosity transforms into something far more dangerous, When the scholar's noble quest for understanding crosses the threshold into territory that human minds were never meant to explore. Stanford Pines, having established himself in the mysterious town of Gravity Falls and documented dozens of anomalous phenomena, found himself standing at precisely such a threshold. His methodical cataloguing of the impossible had led him inevitably to a question that would consume him utterly. What fundamental force or intelligence was responsible for the concentrated weirdness that permeated every aspect of this seemingly ordinary lumber town? The caves beneath Gravity Falls had called to Ford from his earliest days in Oregon, their dark mouths yawning between the roots of ancient pines like invitations to descend into the earth's hidden secrets. His surface research had provided tantalizing glimpses of the town's anomalous nature, but Ford's scientific instincts told him that the real answers lay deeper, buried in the geological foundations that had given birth to so many impossible phenomena. The cave systems, according to local geological surveys, extended for miles beneath the town in a labyrinthine network that had never been fully mapped or explored. Ford's initial cave explorations were conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all his research. He equipped himself with the finest spelunking gear available, installed safety lines and communication equipment, and documented every aspect of his underground journeys with meticulous care. The caves themselves proved to be marvels of natural architecture, their limestone chambers carved by millennia of groundwater flow into cathedral-like spaces that echoed with the whisper of moving air and the distant trickle of hidden streams. But it was not the cave's natural beauty that captured Ford's attention so completely. Rather, it was the evidence of human presence that he discovered in the deepest chambers, signs that these underground spaces had served purposes far beyond mere shelter or storage. The walls bore markings that clearly predated European settlement of the region, symbols and images that spoke of indigenous peoples who had recognized something significant about these particular caves, something that had drawn them into the Earth's depths, for reasons that conventional archaeology could not explain. The petroglyphs that Ford discovered in the cave system's most remote reaches represented perhaps the most significant archaeological find in the Pacific Northwest's recorded history. The artwork, created using pigments and techniques that suggested great antiquity, depicted scenes and figures that challenged every assumption about the region's pre-Columbian inhabitants. These were not the typical hunting scenes or seasonal ceremonies that characterized most Native American rock art, but something far stranger and more disturbing. The central figure that appeared repeatedly throughout the cave paintings was unlike anything in the documented iconography of Pacific Northwest tribes. A triangular form dominated many of the compositions, always rendered with a single, prominent eye that seemed to stare directly at the viewer regardless of the angle from which the artwork was observed. This entity was invariably depicted in positions of power and authority, surrounded by smaller figures that appeared to be either worshipping or fleeing from its presence. Ford's training in comparative mythology and anthropological research provided him with frameworks for interpreting religious and ceremonial artwork, but these cave paintings defied easy categorization. The triangular figure possessed characteristics that appeared in various cultures' depictions of supernatural entities. Yet it was unlike any specific deity or spirit from documented belief systems. It seemed to represent something universal yet alien, familiar yet utterly foreign to human understanding. Accompanying the triangular entity in many of the cave paintings was a symbol that would become increasingly significant in Ford's research, a complex circular design featuring various smaller symbols arranged around its perimeter. The wheel-like configuration suggested astronomical or calendrical significance, but the individual elements within the circle bore no resemblance to known celestial markers or temporal indicators. Instead, they appeared to represent a collection of disparate objects and creatures, each rendered with the same careful attention to detail that characterized the triangular figure itself. Ford's documentation of the cave paintings required weeks of careful work, photographing each composition from multiple angles and creating detailed sketches that captured nuances lost in photographic reproduction. The pigments used in the artwork proved remarkably well preserved, despite their obvious age, retaining colors and clarity that suggested either exceptional preservation conditions or artistic techniques unknown to modern archaeology. Several of the larger compositions required scaffolding to properly document, their placement high on chamber walls, indicating that their creation had required considerable effort and planning. As Ford studied the cave paintings night after night in his laboratory, poring over photographs and sketches by lamplight, he began to perceive patterns and relationships that had not been immediately apparent during his initial cave explorations. The triangular entity appeared to be the central figure in a complex narrative that unfolded across multiple chambers and dozens of individual compositions. The story these ancient artists had preserved in stone spoke of contact between human beings and something that operated according to rules and purposes beyond human comprehension. The more Ford learned about the cave paintings, the more convinced he became that they represented not mythology or religious symbolism, but historical documentation of actual events. The consistency of the artistic style across multiple chambers, the precise attention to detail in the depiction of the triangular entity, and the obvious reverence with which the entire body of work had been created, all suggested that these were records of real encounters rather than imaginative creations. Ford's attempts to correlate the cave paintings with documented Native American traditions proved frustratingly inconclusive. While several Pacific Northwest tribes possessed oral histories that made vague reference to supernatural entities and otherworldly encounters, none contained specific descriptions that matched the triangular figure or the wheel-like symbol that appeared so prominently in the cave art. It was as if the knowledge preserved in stone had been deliberately excluded from the cultural traditions that survived into the modern era. The implications of this exclusion troubled Ford deeply. If the cave paintings documented real historical events, why had the memory of those events been so thoroughly erased from tribal traditions? What could have been so traumatic or dangerous that entire cultures chose to forget rather than preserve the knowledge for future generations? The very absence of oral traditions corresponding to the cave paintings seemed to serve as a warning, a collective decision to let certain knowledge die rather than risk its consequences. Yet Ford's scientific training compelled him to pursue understanding regardless of potential dangers. The cave paintings represented a unique window into pre-Columbian history, possibly the only surviving record of events that had shaped the development of an entire region. His responsibility as a researcher, he believed, was to decode and preserve this knowledge, not to be deterred by superstitious fears or cultural taboos that might have influenced ancient peoples to suppress important information. Ford's translation efforts focused initially on the symbolic elements that appeared most frequently throughout the cave paintings. The triangular entity's eye, rendered with consistent iconographic elements across multiple compositions, seemed to represent knowledge or perception of an otherworldly nature. The various symbols surrounding it in the wheel-like configuration appeared to correspond to different aspects of the natural world. Celestial bodies, weather patterns, geological formations, and living creatures all seemed to be represented within the circular design. But it was the discovery of actual written text within some of the cave paintings that transformed Ford's research from archaeological documentation into something approaching cryptographic analysis. Hidden within the flowing lines of the artistic compositions were sequences of symbols that clearly represented linguistic rather than purely pictorial information. These proto-writing systems, if Ford's interpretation was correct, preserved not just images of ancient events, but actual incantations and ritual instructions related to the triangular entity. The linguistic analysis required months of painstaking work, correlating symbol frequencies and positional relationships to identify patterns that might indicate grammatical structures or semantic relationships. Ford's background in comparative linguistics, enhanced by his natural aptitude for pattern recognition, gradually revealed what appeared to be a coherent writing system, unlike any documented pre-Columbian script. The symbols possessed a flowing, organic quality that suggested they had been designed for carved rather than written reproduction. Their forms optimized for stone carving techniques rather than ink or paint application. As Ford's understanding of the cave painting's linguistic elements deepened, he began to perceive that certain combinations of symbols appeared to serve ritual or ceremonial purposes. These passages, distinguished by their placement within the artistic compositions and their relationship to the central triangular figure, seemed to represent invocations or summons directed toward the otherworldly entity. The repeated elements within these passages suggested formulaic language, the kind of precise phrasing that characterizes religious or magical practices across many cultures. Ford's academic training had taught him to approach such material with skeptical analysis, to recognize that ancient peoples often attributed supernatural causation to natural phenomena they could not otherwise explain. Yet the cave painting's consistent depiction of the triangular entity across multiple compositions and their obvious antiquity suggested that these were not casual mythological creations, but records of experiences that had profoundly impacted the people who created them. The decision to attempt pronunciation of the incantation passages represented a crucial moment in Ford's research, the point at which scholarly analysis crossed into experimental territory. His linguistic analysis had provided him with reasonable confidence in his phonetic interpretations of the ancient symbols, and his understanding of the writing system's grammatical structures suggested that he could reconstruct the original vocalizations with acceptable accuracy. The scientific method demanded empirical testing of theoretical conclusions, and Ford's theories about the cave paintings could only be validated through direct experimentation. The evening when Ford chose to vocalize the ancient incantations began like any other night in his laboratory. He had been working late, as had become his habit, surrounded by photographs of cave paintings and notebooks filled with linguistic analysis. The symbols that had once seemed impossibly alien now appeared almost familiar, their meanings clear in his mind after months of intensive study. The passage he selected for vocalization was one of the shorter sequences, a relatively simple combination of symbols that appeared to serve introductory or greeting purposes in the ancient script. Ford's pronunciation of the ancient words felt strange on his tongue, the phonetic combinations unlike anything in his experience with modern or historical languages. The sounds seemed to resonate oddly in his laboratory, creating harmonics and echoes that his acoustic analysis could not adequately explain. Yet even as the final syllables faded into silence, Ford felt certain that his pronunciation had been essentially correct, that he had successfully reproduced sounds that had not been heard for perhaps centuries or millennia. The immediate effects of Ford's incantation were subtle enough that he initially attributed them to fatigue and the lateness of the hour. A slight disorientation, a sense that the familiar surroundings of his laboratory had shifted in some indefinable way, seemed easily explained by the intensity of his concentration and the strain of working with unfamiliar linguistic structures. It was only when Ford attempted to continue his research that he began to realize something fundamental had changed. Sleep, when it finally came to Ford that night, brought with it experiences unlike any he had previously known. His dreams possessed a vividness and coherence that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of unconscious experience, presenting him with visions that felt more real than waking reality. In these dream visions, Ford found himself standing once again in the ancient caves, but now the stone chambers were alive with activity, populated by figures whose presence made the cave painting's historical significance unmistakably clear. The triangular entity appeared to Ford in his dreams, not as static cave art, but as a living presence of overwhelming intelligence and charisma. The being's single eye regarded Ford with what seemed like amused recognition, as if their meeting had been anticipated and planned. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of cosmic authority, combined with an almost paternal warmth that immediately put Ford at ease, despite the utterly alien nature of their encounter. "Well, well, well," the triangular entity said, its words somehow comprehensible, despite originating from a form that possessed no visible mouth or vocal apparatus. "Finally, someone with enough brains to figure out the calling card I left behind. Stanford Pines, I presume? I've been waiting quite some time for someone of your intellectual caliber to find their way to my little message system." Ford's initial reaction combined scholarly excitement with the natural fear any rational person would experience when confronted with the impossible. Yet the entity's manner was so engaging, so clearly that of a superior intelligence addressing a promising student, that Ford found his terror giving way to fascination. Here apparently was the source of Gravity Falls anomalies, the intelligence behind the phenomena that had brought him across the country in pursuit of scientific understanding. The triangular being introduced itself with casual grandeur, claiming a name that would become burned into Ford's memory: Bill Cipher. The name itself seemed to carry significance beyond its phonetic elements, suggesting both the mathematical precision of its bearer's nature and the cryptographic complexity of its purposes. Bill explained that he had been observing Ford's research with growing approval, impressed by the young scientist's determination to pursue knowledge despite the obvious dangers and difficulties involved. "I only choose to work with the most brilliant minds," Bill continued, his single eye never wavering from Ford's face. "Once every century or so, someone comes along with enough intelligence and determination to be worth my attention. Congratulations, Stanford. You've just won the cosmic lottery." Bill's explanation of his nature and purposes was delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed without question. He claimed to be a being of pure energy and intelligence, unbound by the physical laws that constrained lesser entities, capable of perceiving and manipulating reality in ways that biological creatures could never hope to understand. His interest in Ford, he explained, was motivated by a desire to share knowledge and advance scientific understanding through collaboration between different forms of consciousness. The proposition Bill presented was seductive in its apparent simplicity. He would serve as Ford's research assistant and guide, providing insights and information that no earthbound intelligence could possibly access. In exchange, Ford would serve as his anchor to the physical world, documenting discoveries and implementing theories that would advance human understanding by centuries or millennia. The arrangement would be mutually beneficial, Bill claimed, allowing both participants to achieve goals that would be impossible through independent effort. Ford's acceptance of Bill's proposal was perhaps inevitable, given his lifelong hunger for knowledge and his isolation from normal human relationships. Here was an intelligence that not only appreciated his gifts, but promised to enhance them beyond anything he had previously imagined possible. The loneliness that had characterized so much of Ford's life, from his childhood rejection to his current exile from mainstream academic circles, seemed to dissolve in the presence of someone who truly understood and valued his unique capabilities. The collaborative relationship that developed between Ford and Bill began with small demonstrations of the interdimensional being's knowledge and abilities. Bill would appear in Ford's dreams with information about anomalous phenomena that Ford had not yet discovered, providing detailed explanations of their underlying mechanisms and suggesting productive avenues for future research. Upon awakening, Ford would find that Bill's guidance invariably proved accurate, leading to discoveries and insights that advanced his understanding in ways that years of independent research might not have achieved. Bill's knowledge seemed to encompass not only the specific anomalies of gravity falls, but the fundamental principles that governed reality itself. He explained concepts that challenged Ford's understanding of physics, mathematics, and biology. Yet his explanations were always coherent and verifiable through experimental testing. Under Bill's tutelage, Ford began to perceive patterns and relationships that had been invisible to his unaided intellect, seeing connections between disparate phenomena that revealed the underlying unity behind apparent chaos. The trust that developed between Ford and Bill was based on what seemed like obvious mutual benefit and shared intellectual curiosity. Bill's vast knowledge was matched by Ford's technical skills and scientific methodology, creating a partnership that combined theoretical understanding with practical application. Ford began to feel that he had found not just a research assistant but a true peer, someone whose intelligence matched his own and whose cosmic perspective provided insights that no human collaborator could offer. Yet even as Ford embraced this new partnership, subtle warning signs began to accumulate around the edges of his awareness. Bill's knowledge sometimes included information about events that had not yet occurred, suggesting prescience that went beyond mere intelligence and into territory that challenged Ford's understanding of causality itself. The interdimensional being's casual references to other worlds, and other times hinted at experiences and capabilities that seemed almost godlike in their scope and implications. More disturbing were the occasions when Bill's demeanor would shift, revealing glimpses of something darker and more alien beneath his charming exterior. Brief moments when his eye would glow with malevolent intensity, when his voice would carry undertones of barely contained power, when his words would suggest purposes and plans that extended far beyond scientific collaboration. These episodes were always brief and quickly explained away with humor and reassurance, but they left Ford with nagging doubts about his new partner's true nature and intentions. The third journal that Ford began during this period of collaboration reflected his growing dependence on Bill's guidance and his increasing isolation from normal human concerns. The entries became more technical and esoteric, filled with theoretical frameworks and experimental procedures that drew heavily on Bill's otherworldly knowledge. Ford's writing style evolved from careful scientific documentation to something approaching mystical revelation, as if he were serving as a conduit for intelligence that transcended human understanding. Bill's influence on Ford's research extended beyond mere information sharing into active collaboration on projects that pushed the boundaries of what conventional science considered possible. Together, they explored theoretical frameworks that merged quantum mechanics with consciousness studies, developed experimental protocols that seemed to violate conservation laws, and documented phenomena that existed at the intersection of physical reality and pure thought. Ford found himself working at the very edge of human understanding, guided by an intelligence that seemed to comprehend principles that earthbound minds could only dimly perceive. Yet the price of this collaboration was becoming increasingly apparent in Ford's isolation from human contact and his growing dependence on Bill's presence. His research consumed all his time and attention. His social connections dwindled to non-existence, and his communication with the outside world became sporadic and eventually ceased altogether. Ford existed in a private universe of shared knowledge and cosmic revelation, sustained by the conviction that he was participating in the greatest scientific undertaking in human history. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider the seductive power of knowledge, offered without price, of intelligence that promises to transcend human limitations through supernatural assistance. Ford's acceptance of Bill's partnership represented both the culmination of his scholarly ambitions and the beginning of his descent into territory where human understanding becomes dangerous liability rather than valuable asset. The ancient warnings preserved in cave paintings had been ignored, the wisdom of forgotten cultures dismissed as primitive superstition, and the consequences of that dismissal were about to unfold with cosmic implications that would threaten not just Ford's sanity, but the very fabric of reality itself. There comes a moment in every partnership when the true nature of each participant reveals itself, when the masks of mutual benefit fall away to expose the underlying motivations that drive collaborative effort. For Stanford Pines and Bill Cipher, this moment of revelation was still months in the future, hidden behind a facade of shared intellectual excitement and the intoxicating promise of breakthrough discoveries that would reshape human understanding of reality itself. The interdimensional portal that would ultimately consume Ford's sanity and separate him from his world for 30 years began as nothing more than an ambitious theoretical concept, a logical extension of the research that had brought him to Gravity Falls in the first place. Bill's proposal for the Portal project emerged gradually from their ongoing collaboration, presented not as a single overwhelming undertaking, but as the natural next step in Ford's investigation of dimensional anomalies. The interdimensional being's explanations of Gravity Falls' unusual properties had revealed that the town's weirdness stemmed from weak points in the fabric of reality itself, places where the boundaries between dimensions had become thin enough to allow limited transfer of matter and energy. These natural portals, Bill explained, were unstable and unpredictable, opening and closing according to cosmic rhythms that operated beyond human comprehension. But imagine, Bill suggested during one of their nightly dream conferences, his single eye gleaming with what Ford interpreted as scientific enthusiasm. If we could create a controlled, permanent gateway between dimensions, think of the knowledge we could access, the specimens we could study, the fundamental questions about the nature of existence that we could finally answer definitively. The concept was seductive beyond Ford's ability to resist. Here was the opportunity to move beyond mere documentation of anomalies into active exploration of their sources, to transform his research from passive observation into dynamic investigation. The portal would represent the culmination of everything he had worked towards since arriving in Gravity Falls, the ultimate vindication of his decision to pursue anomaly research despite the isolation and skepticism it had brought him. Bill's technical specifications for the portal were delivered with the casual authority of someone who had observed similar constructions across multiple realities. The device would require precise geometric configuration to properly channel dimensional energies, sophisticated control mechanisms to regulate the flow of matter and energy between realities, and massive amounts of power to overcome the natural resistance that prevented casual dimensional travel. The project would push human engineering capabilities to their absolute limits, demanding innovations in materials science, energy manipulation, and quantum mechanics that had never been attempted before. Ford's excitement at the prospect of undertaking such an ambitious project was matched only by his recognition that he could not possibly complete it alone. The technical challenges involved in portal construction required expertise in mechanical engineering and practical fabrication that exceeded his theoretical knowledge, no matter how extensive. The obvious solution was to contact his old friend and collaborator Fiddleford McGucket, whose combination of mechanical genius and loyalty to Ford made him the ideal partner for such an undertaking. The letter Ford composed to McGucket was crafted with careful attention to both the urgency of his request and the need to maintain secrecy about the project's true nature. Ford could not, of course, reveal the existence of Bill's cipher or the interdimensional origins of his portal specifications. Instead, he described the project in terms that McGucket would find both believable and compelling: a breakthrough in electromagnetic field manipulation that could revolutionize transportation technology and provide unprecedented insights into the fundamental structure of space-time. McGucket's response to Ford's invitation arrived with gratifying speed, expressing not only willingness to assist with the project, but genuine excitement at the prospect of working alongside his old friend once again. The years since their graduation had not been kind to McGucket's career aspirations. His mechanical genius, while recognized within academic circles, had not translated into the kind of commercial success or professional recognition that his talents deserved. The opportunity to participate in what Ford described as potentially revolutionary research offered both intellectual stimulation and the chance to escape from the disappointments that had characterized his post-university experience. Ford's reunion with McGucket at the Gravity Falls bus station was marked by the easy familiarity of old friends whose fundamental compatibility had not been diminished by years of separation. McGucket arrived with characteristic enthusiasm, his bags packed with tools and equipment that spoke of someone prepared for any conceivable engineering challenge. His appearance had changed little since their university days, his hair perhaps slightly wilder, his overalls bearing the accumulated stains of countless mechanical projects, but his essential nature unchanged. The workshop that Ford had prepared for McGucket's arrival was equipped with the finest tools and materials that grant money could purchase, arranged with careful attention to both functionality and comfort. Ford had spared no expense in creating an environment where McGucket's talents could flourish, understanding that the success of the portal project would depend entirely on his friend's ability to transform theoretical specifications into working machinery. McGucket's first reaction to the portal blueprints was everything Ford had hoped for and more. His eyes widened with genuine appreciation as he studied the technical drawings, his mechanical intuition immediately grasping both the elegance of the design and the complexity of its implementation. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," he murmured, tracing component relationships with a practiced finger. Here's about the most ambitious piece of engineering I've ever laid eyes on. It's going to take some doing, but I reckon we can make her work." The excavation required to create space for the portal represented perhaps the most physically demanding aspect of the entire project. Ford had selected a location beneath his laboratory, where natural cave formations would provide both structural support and concealment for their work. The digging proceeded slowly and carefully, with specialized equipment brought in under cover of darkness to avoid attracting unwanted attention from curious townspeople. McGucket approached the construction challenges with characteristic ingenuity, developing innovative solutions to problems that would have stymied conventional engineers. The portal's triangular configuration required precise geometric alignment that pushed standard surveying techniques to their limits, while the exotic materials specified in Bill's plans demanded fabrication methods that had never been attempted at such scale. Each component had to be machined to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, then assembled according to sequences that seemed to defy logical construction principles. The power requirements for portal operation proved to be among the most daunting challenges McGucket encountered. The energy needed to breach dimensional barriers exceeded the output of any conventional power source, requiring the construction of specialized generators that operated according to principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about energy conservation. McGuckett's designs incorporated feedback loops and resonance amplification systems that seemed to violate thermodynamic laws, yet functioned exactly as Bill's specifications predicted they would. Ford's role in the construction process was primarily supervisory and theoretical, ensuring that every aspect of the build conformed precisely to Bill's interdimensional blueprints, while McGuckett handled the practical implementation. The arrangement worked well initially, combining Ford's absolute certainty about design requirements with McGuckett's unparalleled ability to transform theoretical concepts into functional hardware. Their collaboration recaptured much of the easy efficiency that had characterized their university partnership, each man contributing his unique strengths to their shared endeavor. Yet as construction progressed, subtle tensions began to emerge between the two friends. McGuckett's natural curiosity about the portal's intended function was met with increasingly evasive responses from Ford, who found himself unable to provide satisfactory explanations without revealing details about Bill's involvement. The technical specifications they were following incorporated principles that seemed to contradict established scientific understanding, yet Ford insisted on absolute adherence to designs whose theoretical foundations he could not adequately explain. McGuckett's growing unease was exacerbated by the secretive nature of their work environment. The portal construction took place entirely underground, isolated from normal human activity, illuminated by artificial light that cast strange shadows among the growing mechanical components. The device itself began to emit unusual electromagnetic signatures as assembly progressed, creating interference patterns that affected sensitive equipment throughout Ford's laboratory complex. The decision to install a metal plate in Ford's skull was presented to McGuckett as a necessary precaution against the portal's electromagnetic emissions, a medical procedure designed to protect Ford's brain from the intense energy fields the device would generate during operation. Ford's explanation was technically plausible, incorporating enough genuine scientific terminology to satisfy McGuckett's questions, while concealing the true purpose of the implant, preventing Bill from possessing Ford's body during the critical phases of portal construction. The surgical procedure itself was conducted at a discreet medical facility several hours' drive from Gravity Falls, performed by specialists who asked no questions about their patient's unusual request. Ford's recovery was swift and uncomplicated, though the psychological effects of having foreign metal permanently embedded in his skull proved more disturbing than he had anticipated. The plate's presence created a constant sense of disconnection from his own thoughts, a subtle barrier between conscious awareness and the deeper intuitive processes that had always guided his scientific work. Bill's reaction to the metal plate installation was one of amused tolerance rather than serious concern. "A bit paranoid, aren't we, Stanford?" he observed during their next dream meeting. "But I suppose a little caution never hurt anyone. Just remember who your real partner is in this endeavor. A few ounces of metal aren't going to change the fundamental nature of our collaboration." The first test of the portal's basic systems was conducted with elaborate safety precautions, including the use of a crash test dummy to evaluate the device's effects on organic matter. McGuckett monitored the power systems while Ford operated the control mechanisms, both men wearing protective equipment designed to shield them from the intense electromagnetic radiations the portal generated during startup sequences. The dummy's journey through the dimensional gateway lasted only seconds, but the readings they obtained confirmed that the portal was functioning exactly as Bill's specifications had predicted. The crash test dummy emerged from its interdimensional journey physically intact but subtly altered in ways that their instruments could barely detect. Molecular analysis revealed structural changes at the subatomic level, reorganizations of matter that suggested exposure to physical laws operating differently than those governing normal reality. More disturbing were the temporal anomalies associated with the dummy's transit. Chronometer readings indicated that the journey had lasted simultaneously 0 seconds and several hours, depending on the frame of reference from which measurements were taken. Ford's interpretation of these results focused on their positive implications for interdimensional research, viewing the successful transit as confirmation that his theoretical framework was essentially correct. The molecular alterations could be attributed to exposure to exotic physics, while the temporal anomalies suggested fascinating possibilities for investigating the relationship between time and dimensional structure. Bill's guidance had once again proved accurate, demonstrating that their collaboration was producing results that exceeded Ford's most optimistic projections. McGuckett's reaction to the test results was markedly less enthusiastic. His engineering background made him acutely aware of the safety implications of devices that could alter matter at the molecular level, while the temporal anomalies suggested interactions with fundamental forces that human technology was unprepared to handle safely. The portal was functioning as designed, but McGuckett found himself questioning whether the design itself was wise or safe to pursue. "Ford," McGuckett said carefully as they reviewed the test data, "I'm not sure we fully understand what we're dealing with here. These readings suggest effects that go way beyond anything in our experience. Maybe we should slow down, run some more preliminary tests before we attempt anything more ambitious." Ford's response to McGuckett's concerns was characterized by the impatience of someone whose vision extends far beyond immediate safety considerations. The portal represented the culmination of years of research and months of construction, the gateway to discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. Excessive caution at this point would only delay the breakthrough achievements that justified all their effort and sacrifice. The accident that would ultimately destroy McGuckett's sanity occurred during what was intended to be a routine calibration test, a minor adjustment to the portal's focusing mechanisms designed to improve dimensional accuracy. McGuckett was working within the portal chamber itself, making fine adjustments to the crystalline focusing arrays, when a power surge caused the gateway to activate unexpectedly. The safety protocols they had established were insufficient to prevent McGuckett from being caught within the portal's activation field, his body drawn inexorably toward the dimensional aperture. Despite his desperate attempts to reach safety, McGuckett's transit through the portal lasted subjectively for hours, though external chronometers recorded the event as lasting mere seconds. During his involuntary journey between dimensions, McGuckett was exposed to visions of Bill Cipher's true nature and ultimate intentions, revelations that stripped away the benevolent facade the interdimensional being had maintained throughout his collaboration with Ford. The scope of Bill's plans, the cosmic horror of his methods, and the ultimate fate he intended for Earth's dimension were revealed with crystalline clarity that no human mind was prepared to comprehend. The images that burned themselves into McGuckett's consciousness during his dimensional transit were of reality itself being transformed into a playground for interdimensional chaos, of Bill's influence spreading like a virus through the multiverse, consuming entire civilizations and reducing them to sources of amusement for entities whose purposes transcended human understanding. Earth was not the first world Bill had targeted, nor would it be the last. Merely one more reality to be harvested and discarded in service of goals that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. McGuckett's return from his accidental journey left him fundamentally altered, his formerly confident demeanor replaced by wide-eyed terror and an obsessive need to warn others about the dangers they were unleashing. His attempts to communicate what he had witnessed were frustrated by the inadequacy of human language to describe experiences that operated beyond normal sensory parameters. The visions had been too vast, too alien, too fundamentally at odds with earthbound consciousness to be translated into words that could convey their true horror. "Ford," McGucket said, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "We have to destroy it. Right now. That thing you're working with. It's not what it claims to be. I saw what it really wants to do, what it's planning for our world. When gravity falls and Earth becomes sky, fear the beast with just one eye." Ford's reaction to McGucket's warnings was colored by his inability to accept that his greatest scientific collaboration might be built on deception and manipulation. Bill's partnership had provided him with knowledge and capabilities beyond anything he could have achieved independently, validating years of research and opening doorways to understanding that no human had previously accessed. The possibility that this partnership might be fundamentally corrupted challenged not only Ford's current work, but his entire sense of scientific identity and purpose. McGucket's development of the memory gun represented a desperate attempt to escape from knowledge that his human consciousness could not safely contain. The device was designed using principles adapted from their portal research, incorporating field generation technologies that could selectively alter neural patterns associated with specific memories. McGucket's engineering genius, even compromised by trauma and terror, remained sufficient to create a tool capable of surgically removing traumatic experiences from conscious awareness. The first use of the memory gun on himself provided McGucket with temporary relief from the cosmic horror he had witnessed, but the psychological patterns established by that initial erasure would prove impossible to break. Each use of the device removed not only the targeted memories but associated cognitive and emotional connections, gradually eroding the foundation of McGucket's personality and intellectual capabilities. The brilliant engineer, who had been Ford's closest collaborator, began a slow descent into the confused, rambling figure he would eventually become. Ford's confrontation with Bill about the true nature of their partnership represented the moment when collaborative illusion finally collapsed into adversarial reality. Bill's response to Ford's accusations was characterized by casual contempt rather than defensive anger, the reaction of someone whose plans were so advanced that exposure no longer represented a significant threat to their implementation. "Oh, come now, Stanford." Bill laughed, his triangular form radiating amusement rather than concern. "Did you really think I was doing all this out of the goodness of my non-existent heart? I'm a dream demon, not a charity organization. When that portal finishes charging up, your dimension is going to learn how to party, and I do mean party. We're talking about a celebration that will make the last billion years look like a quiet Sunday afternoon." The revelation of Bill's true intentions transformed Ford's understanding of everything they had accomplished together. The portal was not a tool for scientific discovery, but an invasion route, a permanent gateway that would allow Bill and his interdimensional allies to establish permanent residence in Earth's reality. The knowledge Bill had shared was not generous collaboration but strategic manipulation, ensuring that Ford would unknowingly construct the very device that would doom his own world. Ford's attempt to shut down the portal immediately was partially successful, severing the connection between Bill's dimension and Earth's reality, while the gateway was still in its testing phase. The incomplete nature of the shutdown meant that traces of interdimensional energy remained trapped within the device's crystalline focusing arrays, creating a potential future vulnerability that would require constant monitoring and containment. The portal itself remained intact but dormant, a monument to betrayed trust and a permanent reminder of how close Ford had come to destroying everything he claimed to protect. The aftermath of Ford's betrayal by Bill left him isolated not only from interdimensional manipulation but from normal human connection as well. McGucket's sanity had been sacrificed to the project's hidden dangers, his brilliant mind reduced to confusion and paranoid rambling that made meaningful communication impossible. Ford found himself alone with knowledge too dangerous to share and guilt too profound to bear, surrounded by the physical evidence of his greatest failure, disguised as his greatest achievement. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the seductive power of knowledge offered by sources whose true intentions remain hidden, of partnerships that promise mutual benefit while concealing fundamental imbalances of power and purpose. Ford's collaboration with Bill Cipher represents one of history's most dangerous examples of intellectual pride overwhelming prudent caution, of scholarly ambition blinding a brilliant mind to warnings that should have been heeded before irreversible damage was done to both friendships and reality itself. The aftermath of betrayal leaves wounds that extend far deeper than the immediate damage inflicted by deception itself. Stanford pines, standing in the wreckage of his greatest scientific collaboration and confronting the horrifying truth about his cosmic partnership, found himself facing not only the collapse of his life's work, but the terrifying realization that he had been instrumental in bringing his world to the very brink of dimensional catastrophe. The portal that hummed with dormant energy beneath his laboratory was no longer a symbol of scientific achievement, but a monument to manipulation, a sleeping weapon that could awaken at any moment to fulfill the apocalyptic purposes for which it had been designed. Ford's immediate response to discovering Bill's true intentions was characterized by the kind of methodical paranoia that had served him well throughout his academic career. If an interdimensional demon of Bill's apparent power and malevolence had been able to manipulate him so completely, then clearly his previous assumptions about safety and security were woefully inadequate. The laboratory that had once represented a sanctuary for scientific exploration became a fortress under siege, requiring defensive measures that pushed the boundaries between rational precaution and obsessive behavior. The installation of protective wards throughout Ford's research facility drew upon knowledge gleaned from his studies of indigenous folklore and mystical traditions that he had previously dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Ancient symbols carved into door frames and window ledges, salt lines precisely distributed according to geometric principles that operated beyond conventional understanding, and electromagnetic field generators tuned to frequencies that seemed to cause Bill physical discomfort when he attempted to manifest his presence in the physical world. Ford's nights became exercises in vigilant insomnia, his consciousness maintained at the threshold between sleeping and waking to prevent Bill from gaining access to his mind through dreams. The metal plate embedded in his skull provided some protection against direct possession, but Ford had learned through bitter experience that Bill's influence operated through multiple channels, exploiting every vulnerability in human psychology and perception. Sleep represented surrender to unconscious states where Bill's power was greatest, making rest not refreshment but dangerous exposure to continued manipulation. The journals that had begun as careful scientific documentation evolved into something approaching mystical texts, their pages filled with warnings and protective incantations written in invisible ink that revealed itself only under specific lighting conditions. Ford's documentation of his experiences with Bill served dual purposes, preserving crucial information about interdimensional threats, while ensuring that casual readers would not stumble accidentally into the same traps that had ensnared him so completely. The decision to separate and hide the three journals represented Ford's recognition that the knowledge they contained was simultaneously too valuable to destroy and too dangerous to keep together. Each journal held pieces of information that were relatively harmless in isolation but potentially catastrophic when combined, creating a puzzle that would require considerable effort and intelligence to reassemble. Ford's distribution of the journals throughout Gravity Falls was guided by careful analysis of locations that would provide both security and accessibility to future researchers who might need the information to prevent or respond to. dimensional incursions. The transformation of Ford's laboratory into what would eventually become the Mystery Shack was perhaps the most psychologically difficult aspect of his defensive preparations. The scientific instruments that had represented years of accumulated research were covered with tarps and hidden behind false walls. Their precision and sophistication, disguised beneath layers of tourist-friendly nonsense, designed to repel serious investigation. The facility that had once been dedicated to expanding human knowledge became a deliberate monument to intellectual mediocrity, its true purpose concealed behind a facade of harmless entertainment. Ford's isolation during this period was total and self-imposed. His paranoia, extending to every human relationship that might provide Bill with leverage for continued manipulation. The townspeople of Gravity Falls, who had initially welcomed his presence as an educated outsider who might contribute to local economic development, found themselves gently but firmly excluded from his life. Social invitations were declined. Casual conversations were kept superficial and brief, and Ford's public persona became that of an eccentric but harmless researcher whose work held no particular significance or danger. The loneliness that accompanied Ford's defensive withdrawal was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his situation to endure. His entire adult life had been built around the pursuit and sharing of knowledge, the collaborative excitement of discovery and understanding. The forced abandonment of intellectual community left him with resources of mind and curiosity that had no acceptable outlet, creating a psychological pressure that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained paranoia. It was during the darkest period of his isolation, when the weight of his solitary vigilance seemed almost unbearable, that Ford made the decision to reach out to the one person who might possibly understand and forgive the consequences of his cosmic overreach. The postcard he composed to Stanley was a masterpiece of desperate brevity, conveying both urgency and familial appeal while revealing nothing that could be intercepted and used against either of them. Stanley Pines in 1982 was a man whose life had been defined by a series of increasingly desperate attempts to achieve the success that had always seemed just beyond his grasp. The 10 years since his banishment from the family home had been marked by failed business ventures, legal troubles, and a growing reputation for unreliability that made legitimate opportunities increasingly scarce. His natural charm and quick thinking had kept him one step ahead of complete disaster. But each narrow escape had cost him something in terms of self-respect and hope for genuine redemption. The string of schemes that had characterized Stanley's post-banishment existence read like a catalogue of American entrepreneurial desperation. He had sold everything from miracle cleaning products to timeshare vacation properties, always with the conviction that this particular venture would finally prove his worth and justify his father's faith in his potential. Each failure had been accompanied by increasingly creative explanations and increasingly dubious methods of maintaining cash flow, creating a pattern of behavior that put him at odds with both legal authorities and criminal elements who had little patience for his consistently empty promises. Stanley's relationship with money during this period was characterized by the kind of hand-to-mouth existence that makes long-term planning impossible and short-term survival paramount. His possessions fit easily into a single suitcase. His address changed frequently according to the demands of creditors and legal complications, and his meals were often determined more by opportunity than preference. The American dream that had seemed so accessible during his childhood had been replaced by a nightmare of constant insecurity and diminishing options. The criminal enterprises that increasingly dominated Stanley's survival strategies were motivated more by desperation than malice. Petty frauds and confidence games that targeted the gullible and greedy rather than the innocent and vulnerable. His natural ability to read people and situations made him effective at these endeavors. but his fundamental decency prevented him from pursuing the kinds of operations that might have provided genuine financial security. Stanley remained a small-time operator in a world where small-time operators faced increasingly serious consequences for their minor transgressions. The debts that accumulated around Stanley, like gravitational forces, were owed to individuals and organizations whose patience had limits measured in weeks rather than years. Loan sharks and criminal financiers had provided capital for Stanley's various schemes with interest rates and collection methods that made failure not just embarrassing but potentially fatal. The network of obligations and threats that surrounded Stanley's daily existence created a constant pressure that made every interaction potentially dangerous and every decision a calculation of risk versus necessity. Stanley's emotional state during this period was characterized by a complex mixture of regret, resentment, and stubborn refusal to acknowledge defeat. The science fair incident that had ended his relationship with Ford remained a source of guilt that colored every subsequent failure, yet Stanley's pride prevented him from accepting full responsibility for choices that had seemed justified at the time. His anger at Ford's abandonment competed with his recognition that Ford's path had always been destined to diverge from his own, creating an internal conflict that found expression in increasingly self-destructive behavior. The postcard from Ford arrived at a moment when Stanley's options had narrowed to the point where even desperate measures seemed preferable to continued existence on the margins of legitimacy. The message itself was cryptic but unmistakably urgent, suggesting that Ford faced difficulties that transcended academic or professional challenges. For Stanley, the invitation represented not just an opportunity for reconciliation, but potentially his last chance to prove that he could contribute meaningfully to something larger than his own survival. Stanley's journey to Gravity Falls was undertaken with the kind of desperate hope that characterized all his major decisions during this period. The bus ticket consumed most of his remaining cash, leaving him with barely enough money for food during the cross-country trip. His possessions remained limited to what could fit in a single bag, the accumulation of a decade spent moving frequently and owning little. Yet despite his material poverty, Stanley carried with him something that 10 years of failure had not been able to diminish: the memory of partnership with someone who had once valued his contributions and trusted his loyalty. The reunion between the Pines twins took place in Ford's basement laboratory, surrounded by scientific equipment that Stanley could not identify, and documents written in handwriting he remembered, but words he could not understand. The Ford who greeted Stanley after 10 years of separation was recognizable but fundamentally altered, his appearance marked by the kind of sustained stress that comes from living with knowledge too dangerous to share and threats too immediate to ignore. Ford's initial reaction to Stanley's presence was a complex mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. Gratitude for his brother's response to the summons tempered by recognition that Stanley's involvement would inevitably increase the risks associated with the situation. The careful isolation that Ford had maintained for months was broken by Stanley's arrival, creating vulnerabilities that Bill might exploit while providing resources that might prove essential for the challenges ahead. Stanley's assessment of Ford's situation was hampered by his lack of scientific background, and Ford's inability to provide complete explanations without revealing information that would only increase the danger they both faced. The laboratory equipment, the hidden journals, the protective symbols carved into door frames and window ledges, all spoke of circumstances that extended far beyond anything Stanley had encountered in his decade of involvement with various questionable enterprises. The argument that erupted between the twins was inevitable, representing the collision of 10 years of accumulated grievances with the immediate pressures of Ford's dimensional crisis. Stanley's hurt at being contacted only when Ford needed help clashed with Ford's frustration at having to explain complex dangers to someone whose understanding of science remained limited to what he had learned in high blank school. Old patterns of communication breakdown reasserted themselves with depressing familiarity. Each brother's words interpreted through the lens of past injuries and present fears. Stanley's accusation that Ford had abandoned him for academic glory met Ford's counterclaim that Stanley had sabotaged his future out of jealousy and selfishness. The science fair incident was relitigated with all the passion and pain of its original occurrence, each brother presenting evidence for his interpretation of events, while dismissing the other's perspective as self-serving revisionism. Neither man was entirely wrong in his assessment of what had happened 30 years earlier, but neither was capable of acknowledging the validity of the other's experience. The physical altercation that followed their verbal confrontation was perhaps inevitable, representing the regression to childhood patterns of conflict resolution that had characterized their relationship before Ford's academic achievements created distance between them. Years of accumulated anger and frustration found expression in the kind of undignified wrestling match that would have seemed comical under different circumstances, but felt tragically appropriate given the magnitude of their mutual disappointment. The accidental reactivation of the portal occurred during the height of their struggle, a random collision with control mechanisms that Ford had assumed were safely locked in inactive mode. The device responded to the inadvertent input with immediate and overwhelming energy discharge, creating electromagnetic effects that filled the laboratory with brilliant blue light and reality, distorting phenomena that defied easy description. The dormant weapon that Ford had spent months carefully monitoring suddenly roared back to life with all the cosmic menace it had possessed during its original construction. Stanley's first glimpse of the portal in full operation was accompanied by the terrifying realization that his brother's warnings about dangerous research had been massive understatements of the actual situation. The swirling vortex of interdimensional energy represented forces beyond anything in Stanley's experience, yet its operations seemed to depend on equipment and controls that looked almost mundane in their technological familiarity. The contradiction between the portal's cosmic significance and its mechanical components created a cognitive dissonance that would influence Stanley's approach to the device for the next 30 years. Ford's immediate response to the portal's reactivation was characteristically methodical despite the chaos of the situation. His understanding of the device's operation allowed him to begin emergency shutdown procedures, even while struggling to maintain physical position against the gravitational anomalies that the portal's operation created throughout the laboratory. The knowledge that had taken months to accumulate became essential survival information in the space of seconds, demonstrating the value of theoretical preparation for practical emergencies. The gravitational distortions generated by the portal's operation created physical conditions that made normal movement impossible and escape increasingly unlikely. Both brothers found themselves drawn inexorably toward the dimensional gateway, their struggles against the artificial gravitational field serving only to delay rather than prevent their approach to the swirling vortex. Ford's scientific understanding of their predicament provided no comfort, only the terrible knowledge of what interdimensional transit would mean for anyone unprepared for the experience. Stanley's desperate attempt to help Ford escape the portal's gravitational pull was motivated by instinctive brotherly loyalty rather than understanding of the cosmic implications involved. His actions in reaching toward Ford represented the same protective impulse that had characterized their childhood relationship, the automatic response of someone whose identity had been shaped by partnership with another person. Yet his efforts to assist only succeeded in bringing him closer to the dimensional gateway, increasing the likelihood that both brothers would be lost to interdimensional exile. The moment of Ford's disappearance into the portal was marked by a kind of temporal distortion that made the event simultaneously instantaneous and eternal. Stanley's perception of the incident would be colored by the guilt and helplessness of watching his brother vanish into cosmic forces beyond human comprehension, while Ford's experience involved transition into realms where normal concepts of time and space ceased to operate according to earthbound principles. Ford's first moments in the interdimensional void were characterized by the kind of sensory overload that accompanies exposure to realities operating according to fundamentally different physical laws. The landscape that surrounded him bore no resemblance to earthbound geography, its colors and textures suggesting materials and processes that had never existed within normal dimensional boundaries. The very air seemed to carry information and energy that challenged his biological system's ability to process and integrate environmental input. The creatures that inhabited the interdimensional realms represented life forms that had evolved according to selection pressures and environmental conditions, completely unlike those that had shaped terrestrial biology. Their appearances defied easy description or categorization, combining characteristics from multiple earthbound species while displaying features that had no terrestrial analogues whatsoever. Many seemed to possess intelligence that operated according to principles foreign to human cognition, creating communication challenges that made establishing basic safety and survival protocols extremely difficult. Ford's survival in the interdimensional void required rapid adaptation to environmental conditions that changed according to no discernible pattern or logic. The fundamental constants that governed physics within Earth's dimension proved unreliable or completely absent in many of the realms through which he found himself traveling. Gravity might operate in multiple directions simultaneously, time could flow backward or at variable rates, and matter itself possessed properties that made conventional tools and techniques useless for basic survival tasks. The weapons and survival equipment that Ford acquired during his interdimensional exile were cobbled together from materials and technologies encountered in various realms, their designs reflecting the pragmatic genius of someone whose life depended on rapid improvisation and adaptation. Each item represented hard-won knowledge about interdimensional physics and alien manufacturing techniques, accumulated through experiences that would have been impossible to survive without the kind of methodical intelligence that had characterized Ford's earthbound scientific career. Ford's attempts to communicate with Earth during his exile were hampered by the fundamental incompatibility between interdimensional physics and conventional electromagnetic transmission methods. The messages he managed to send required sophisticated manipulation of quantum entanglement, phenomena, and electromagnetic field resonance patterns that operated across dimensional boundaries, according to principles that challenged even his enhanced understanding of theoretical physics. Each successful transmission represented a triumph of applied science under conditions where conventional scientific assumptions provided no reliable guidance. Stanley's parallel journey during Ford's 30-year exile was marked by the kind of determined obsession that had once characterized Ford's own pursuit of anomaly research. The portal that had consumed his brother became the focus of Stanley's existence. Its reconstruction and operation, consuming all his time, energy, and resources. Despite his lack of formal scientific training, his approach to the challenge was characteristically practical rather than theoretical, learning through experimentation and failure rather than systematic study of underlying principles. The gradual transformation of Stanley, from small-time criminal to competent interdimensional engineer, represented perhaps the most remarkable personal development of his entire life. The brother, who had once sabotaged Ford's science fair project through ignorance and desperation, became someone capable of operating equipment that challenged the understanding of trained physicists. His success was built on the kind of persistent determination that formal education cannot teach, the willingness to fail repeatedly while learning from each mistake until success becomes inevitable. Ford's experiences in the interdimensional void gradually transformed him from sheltered academic into seasoned survivor, someone whose theoretical knowledge had been tempered by practical exposure to dangers beyond earthbound imagination. The battles he fought, the allies he made, and the enemies he defeated during his exile created a foundation of experience that would prove essential for the challenges that awaited his eventual return to his home dimension. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider the price that separation exacts from relationships that were meant to endure, the way pride and misunderstanding can transform love into weapons that wound those we most wish to protect. The 30-year exile that divided the Pines twins represented not just physical separation, but the parallel journeys of two men learning to become worthy of reunion, preparing through solitary struggle for the ultimate test of their bond that would determine not just their personal fate, but the survival of their entire world. The mechanics of interdimensional travel had taught Stanford Pines many lessons during his 3 decades of exile, but perhaps none so profound as the recognition that homecoming rarely resembles the scenarios constructed by hope and memory. The portal that had consumed him in a moment of brotherly conflict now hummed with purposeful energy, its crystalline components aligned with mathematical precision that spoke of someone's painstaking dedication to theoretical principles Ford had never bothered to explain adequately. The blue light that erupted from the gateway's core carried with it not just electromagnetic radiation, but the accumulated weight of 30 years spent in preparation for this singular moment of return. Ford's emergence from the interdimensional void was accompanied by sensory adjustments that reminded him how thoroughly his physiology had adapted to environments where normal physical laws operated as suggestions rather than constants. The familiar weight of Earth's gravity felt simultaneously comforting and restrictive after decades spent in realms where movement had depended more on will than physics. The air carried scents and sounds that triggered memories he had carefully suppressed during his exile, fragments of a life that had seemed increasingly dreamlike as the years of separation accumulated into decades of transformation. The laboratory that surrounded Ford upon his return bore evidence of modifications and improvements that spoke eloquently of someone's systematic approach to problems he had never anticipated. The portal's control systems had been upgraded with components that combined his original theoretical framework with practical innovations born of trial and error experimentation. The safety protocols that had been minimal during the device's original construction had been expanded into comprehensive monitoring systems that demonstrated both engineering competence and hard-won understanding of the portal's operational hazards. Yet it was not the mechanical improvements that struck Ford most powerfully during those first moments of return, but rather the presence of the figure who stood before the portal's controls with an expression of triumph mixed with exhaustion. Stanley Pines bore the physical marks of 3 decades spent pursuing goals that had demanded every resource of determination and intelligence he possessed. His face showed the accumulated stress of years spent solving problems that would have challenged trained physicists, while his posture suggested someone who had learned to carry burdens far heavier than anything his early life had prepared him to bear. Ford's first words upon returning to his home dimension were not expressions of gratitude or joy at reunion, but rather technical assessments of the risks that Stanley's achievement had created. His 3 decades of exile had been spent among civilizations that had fallen victim to interdimensional predators. His survival had depended on constant vigilance against threats that operated according to logic alien to human understanding, and his return to Earth carried with it the terrible knowledge that similar threats now faced his own world. The punch that Ford delivered to Stanley's face was motivated not by ingratitude but by the kind of desperate fear that accompanies recognition of cosmic dangers beyond normal human comprehension. The portal's reactivation represented not rescue but potential catastrophe, the creation of a permanent gateway that could allow forces like Bill Cipher to establish footholds in Earth's reality. Ford's 3 decades of interdimensional experience had taught him that opening doors between worlds inevitably attracted attention from entities whose purposes were rarely benevolent. Stanley's reaction to Ford's violent greeting combined hurt surprise with defensive anger, emotions that reflected not only the immediate physical assault, but 30 years of accumulated resentment at being treated as intellectually inferior by someone whose survival had depended entirely on Stanley's determination and competence. The brother who had once sabotaged a science fair project through ignorance had spent 3 decades mastering principles that challenged the understanding of trained scientists. Yet Ford's first response was criticism, rather than acknowledgement of this remarkable achievement. The argument that erupted between the twins during Ford's first hours back in his home dimension was perhaps inevitable, representing the collision of 2 fundamentally different perspectives on the events that had shaped their lives since childhood. Ford's experience of interdimensional exile had reinforced his conviction that Stanley's actions were characterized by reckless disregard for consequences, while Stanley's 3 decades of devoted effort to rescue his brother had only strengthened his belief that Ford's intellectual arrogance blinded him to the value of loyalty and determination. Ford's detailed explanation of the risks associated with portal operation drew upon knowledge accumulated through direct exposure to interdimensional politics and cosmic threats that operated beyond earthbound imagination. His warnings about Bill Cipher and the entities that sought entry to Earth's reality were delivered with the authority of someone who had witnessed entire civilizations consumed by forces they had been unprepared to understand or resist. Yet his inability to acknowledge Stanley's remarkable achievement in mastering the portal's operation undermined the credibility of warnings that should have been received with serious attention. Stanley's response to Ford's cosmic warnings was colored by 3 decades of practical experience with the portal's operation and his intimate familiarity with its mechanical systems and safety protocols. His understanding of the device was based on empirical observation rather than theoretical framework, accumulated through years of experimentation that had taught him to recognize and respond to operational anomalies before they could develop into serious hazards. His dismissal of Ford's warnings reflected not ignorance, but confidence born of extensive hands-on experience with equipment Ford had abandoned in incomplete and dangerous condition. The revelation of Ford's identity to Dipper and Mabel Pines represented a moment of profound significance that transcended mere family reunion. The mysterious author whose journals had guided their summer adventures was revealed to be not some distant historical figure but their own great uncle, a man whose experiences encompassed knowledge and dangers that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The children's initial excitement at meeting the legendary figure was tempered by recognition that his return signaled escalation of threats they had only begun to comprehend. Ford's assessment of Dipper and Mabel during their first meeting was influenced by his 3 decades of experience with civilizations that had failed to recognize or respond adequately to interdimensional threats. The children's casual familiarity with supernatural phenomena spoke well of their adaptability and courage, yet their youth and inexperience made them vulnerable to dangers that had consumed entire worlds, whose inhabitants possessed far greater resources and knowledge. His protective instincts, honed by decades of survival in hostile environments, immediately identified them as potential liabilities rather than assets in the cosmic struggle he knew was approaching. The basement laboratory that Ford claimed as his primary workspace upon returning to Earth reflected his understanding that normal social interactions represented luxuries he could not afford, while cosmic threats remained unresolved. The facility's isolation from casual visitors and its sophisticated security systems provided necessary protection for research that could not be conducted safely in locations accessible to curious townspeople or potential interdimensional agents. Ford's withdrawal from normal human contact was motivated not by antisocial tendencies, but by recognition that his presence endangered anyone who came into prolonged contact with him or his work. Dipper's eager attempts to establish connection with Ford were met with responses that reflected the older man's hard-won understanding of how curiosity could become liability when directed towards subjects beyond human comprehension. Ford's refusal to accept Dipper as research partner was based not on judgment of the boy's intelligence or potential, but on knowledge of how interdimensional threats operated and the recognition that exposure to such dangers required preparation that no adolescent could reasonably be expected to possess. The bonding that eventually developed between Ford and Dipper over their shared enthusiasm for dungeons, and more dungeons represented a rare moment of normal human connection in Ford's carefully isolated existence. The game provided a framework for intellectual engagement that allowed both participants to exercise their analytical capabilities without exposing either to the kinds of existential risks that characterized Ford's primary research. Their collaborative problem-solving within the game's fantasy framework demonstrated compatibility that might have flourished under different circumstances, when cosmic threats did not make casual relationships potential vectors for planetary destruction. The escalation of conflicts between Ford and Stanley during the former's early weeks back on Earth reflected fundamental disagreements about priorities and methods that had been developing since childhood, but had been crystallized by their divergent experiences during the 30-year separation. Ford's exposure to interdimensional politics had convinced him that systematic preparation and theoretical understanding were essential for survival, while Stanley's 3 decades of practical experience with portal operation had taught him that intuitive problem-solving and determined action often succeeded where careful planning failed. Stanley's arguments that Ford should acknowledge and appreciate the remarkable achievement represented by the portal's reconstruction were met with responses that revealed how thoroughly Ford's priorities had been shaped by cosmic perspective. The technical competence that Stanley had demonstrated was undeniable, yet from Ford's point of view, such achievements were meaningless if they facilitated planetary destruction through inadequate understanding of interdimensional threats. The very success of Stanley's efforts to rescue his brother had created vulnerabilities that might doom their entire world. Ford's discovery of the interdimensional rift during his systematic assessment of the portal's current condition represented confirmation of his worst fears about the long-term consequences of the device's operation. The tear in dimensional fabric was small and currently stable, but Ford's experience with similar phenomena in other realities had taught him that such rifts invariably expanded over time until they became large enough to permit transit by entities whose presence would transform Earth into something unrecognizable to its current inhabitants. The decision to reveal Bill Cipher's existence and threat level to Dipper and Mabel was made with recognition that their previous encounters with the entity had already exposed them to dangers that made complete ignorance impossible to maintain. Ford's explanations of Bill's nature and capabilities were delivered with careful attention to providing necessary information while avoiding details that might increase their vulnerability to psychological manipulation. The children's casual familiarity with Bill's methods and personality traits suggested that the threat had already progressed beyond theoretical possibility into active operational status. Ford's attempts to establish protective protocols around the Mystery Shack reflected his understanding that conventional security measures were useless against threats that operated through psychological manipulation and reality distortion. The safeguards he implemented drew upon knowledge accumulated through direct observation of how interdimensional entities operated and what environmental conditions could limit or prevent their manifestation in physical reality. Each protective measure was based on empirical data gathered through experiences that had cost entire civilizations their continued existence. The quest for unicorn hair that Ford assigned to Mabel represented his recognition that certain protective measures required components that existed at the intersection of natural phenomenon and mystical tradition. His 3 decades of interdimensional experience had taught him that the boundaries between science and magic were often arbitrary distinctions that reflected limitations of understanding rather than fundamental differences in operational principles. The unicorn hair's protective properties were based on measurable effects that could be documented and reproduced, even if the underlying mechanisms challenged conventional theoretical frameworks. Ford's development of mental protection devices as backup measures against Bill's psychological infiltration represented application of principles learned through direct exposure to interdimensional warfare. The equipment he constructed incorporated technologies that operated according to quantum mechanical principles that had been unknown to earthbound science. Their designs based on systematic observation of how consciousness interfaces with dimensional structure. Each device represented knowledge that had been purchased through suffering that no human mind should have been required to endure. Dipper's unauthorized exploration of Ford's memories through the mental protection device represented exactly the kind of intellectual curiosity that Ford had learned to recognize as potentially fatal in contexts involving interdimensional threats. The boy's motivations were understandable and even admirable, yet his actions demonstrated how human nature itself could become a vulnerability when confronted with forces that operated beyond normal ethical and logical frameworks. Ford's response to this violation of privacy was colored by recognition that similar curiosity had led to his own manipulation by Bill Cipher decades earlier. The conversation in which Ford revealed the complete truth about his history with Bill Cipher was conducted with careful attention to providing necessary information while avoiding psychological patterns that might increase Dipper's vulnerability to similar manipulation. Ford's account of his own intellectual arrogance and its consequences served as both confession and warning, demonstrating how even brilliant minds could be subverted when pride overcame prudent caution. The story was intended to illustrate dangers rather than adventures, to discourage rather than inspire attempts at independent contact with interdimensional entities. Ford's recognition that Dipper possessed both the intellectual gifts and personality characteristics that had made Ford himself vulnerable to Bill's manipulation was accompanied by determination to protect the boy from repeating mistakes that had cost so much in terms of personal suffering and cosmic risk. The similarities between their approaches to research and their responses to intellectual challenges were striking enough to suggest that Dipper faced exactly the same temptations that had led Ford into collaboration with forces beyond human understanding. The successful implementation of protective measures around the Mystery Shack represented Ford's first unqualified achievement since returning to his home dimension, providing sanctuary that would allow normal family relationships to develop within clearly defined safety parameters. The building's transformation from tourist trap into interdimensional fortress was accomplished through systematic application of principles that balanced maximum protection with minimum disruption to the social dynamics that sustained the extended Pines family unit. Mabel's successful acquisition of unicorn hair and the subsequent completion of protective protocols created conditions that allowed Ford to begin the gradual process of reintegration into human society after 3 decades of enforced isolation. The sanctuary they had created was not a permanent solution to cosmic threats, but it provided breathing space that might allow for development of more comprehensive defensive strategies. Ford's willingness to trust family members with dangerous knowledge represented significant progress from the paranoid isolation that had characterized his early weeks after returning to Earth. The growing trust between Ford and his grandniece and nephew was based on systematic observation of their capabilities and judgment rather than automatic familial affection. Their previous encounters with supernatural phenomena had demonstrated both courage and intelligence, while their responses to warnings about Bill's cipher showed appropriate caution without paralyzing fear. Ford's gradual acceptance of their competence reflected not sentimentality, but hard-headed assessment of their potential contributions to planetary defense efforts. The integration of Ford back into family dynamics was complicated by personality changes that reflected 3 decades of survival in environments where normal human emotions were often liabilities rather than assets. His protective instincts had been honed by exposure to civilizations whose destruction had resulted from inadequate vigilance, while his analytical approach to relationships reflected understanding that trust was resource too valuable to be distributed carelessly. The process of learning to function within family structures while maintaining awareness of cosmic threats required constant balance between human connection and existential preparedness. Ford's systematic documentation of current dimensional stability and threat assessment protocols represented an attempt to establish baseline understanding that might allow for development of predictive models regarding future incursion attempts. His research methods incorporated both theoretical frameworks developed during his original study of gravity falls anomalies and practical techniques learned through interdimensional experience, creating a hybrid approach that combined earthbound scientific methodology with knowledge that transcended planetary boundaries. The weapons and defensive technologies that Ford had acquired during his exile were gradually integrated into Earth-based defensive systems, their alien principles adapted for operation within terrestrial environmental conditions. Each device represented hard-won knowledge about interdimensional warfare tactics and technologies, accumulated through conflicts that had determined the survival of entire species. The process of reverse engineering and adapting these technologies required careful attention to safety protocols that prevented accidental activation of systems designed for use against cosmic-level threats. Ford's growing appreciation for the family relationships that had sustained Stanley during the 30-year separation was accompanied by recognition that such connections represented both strength and vulnerability in contexts involving interdimensional warfare. The emotional bonds that provided motivation for extraordinary achievements also created psychological pressure points that sophisticated enemies could exploit for strategic advantage. Learning to protect family members without isolating them required delicate balance between security measures and human connection. The period of relative stability that followed the successful establishment of protective protocols around the Mystery Shack allowed Ford to begin processing psychological trauma accumulated during 3 decades of interdimensional exile. The constant vigilance required for survival in hostile environments had created mental habits that were adaptive in contexts involving existential threats, but problematic in situations requiring normal social functioning. The gradual relaxation of hypervigilant awareness patterns required conscious effort and systematic desensitization to environmental stimuli that had previously indicated immediate danger. Ford's recognition that his family members had developed their own effective methods for dealing with supernatural threats was accompanied by grudging respect for approaches that differed significantly from his own systematic methodology. Stanley's intuitive problem-solving, Dipper's persistent investigation, and Mabel's creative solutions had achieved results that formal scientific training might not have produced, suggesting that multiple approaches might be necessary for comprehensive planetary defense. The integration of diverse methodologies required careful coordination to prevent conflicts between different operational philosophies. As you settle towards sleep tonight, rest in the knowledge that homecoming, no matter how long anticipated, rarely unfolds according to the scenarios constructed by hope and memory. Ford's return from interdimensional exile was marked not by joyful reunion, but by the complex process of rebuilding relationships that had been interrupted by cosmic forces beyond normal human understanding. The trust that gradually developed between family members was based not on automatic affection, but on systematic demonstration of competence and reliability under pressure that tested every assumption about loyalty, capability, and the price of knowledge that transcends earthbound limitations. The interdimensional rift that Ford had discovered in the wake of the portal's reactivation possessed characteristics that defied conventional understanding of how dimensional barriers should behave under normal circumstances. Unlike the stable, controllable gateway that the portal represented when properly calibrated, this tear in the fabric of reality exhibited the kind of unpredictable expansion patterns that Ford had observed in dying civilizations throughout his 3 decades of exile. The crystalline structure that contained the rift's energy was showing microscopic stress fractures that suggested imminent catastrophic failure, creating a timeline for potential dimensional collapse that measured in days rather than years or decades. Ford's analysis of the rift's deterioration patterns drew upon knowledge accumulated through direct observation of similar phenomena across multiple realities, each representing the final stages of dimensional integrity before complete collapse into what interdimensional travelers had learned to recognize as Weirdmageddon scenarios. The mathematical models that governed rift expansion were consistent across all known cases, suggesting universal principles that operated independently of local physical laws or environmental conditions. Earth's dimensional structure was following the same predictable path toward catastrophic failure that had claimed countless other realities throughout cosmic history. The adhesive compound that Ford believed might stabilize the rift's crystalline container existed in the wreckage of an extraterrestrial vessel that had crashed in the forests surrounding Gravity Falls decades earlier. The craft's hull had been constructed using materials that exhibited properties of dimensional stability far superior to anything available through terrestrial technology, their molecular structure incorporating principles that Earth science had not yet discovered. Ford's identification of this potential solution represented the convergence of his academic training, interdimensional experience, and intimate familiarity with Gravity Falls' catalogue of anomalous phenomena. The expedition to recover the alien adhesive required careful planning that balanced the urgency of their timeline against the significant risks associated with approaching a crash site that had remained undisturbed for decades. The extraterrestrial vessel had been equipped with automated defense systems that remained active despite the craft's destroyed condition, creating a hazard zone that had discouraged investigation by local authorities and casual explorers alike. Ford's knowledge of alien technology protocols, accumulated through his interdimensional travels, provided essential insights into the defensive capabilities they would likely encounter. Dipper's inclusion in the recovery mission was motivated by Ford's recognition that the boy possessed both the intellectual capabilities and physical resilience that the expedition would require, while his smaller size might prove advantageous in navigating the cramped passages within the alien craft. More significantly, Ford's growing assessment of Dipper's potential had led him to consider possibilities that transcended immediate crisis management, envisioning a future in which the boy might serve as successor to Ford's research legacy and guardian of knowledge, too dangerous to be lost through mere mortality. The conversation in which Ford presented his apprenticeship offer to Dipper was conducted with careful attention to both the immediate practical benefits of such an arrangement and the broader implications for the boy's future development. Ford's description of his own academic credentials was intended not as boastful display, but as demonstration of the educational opportunities that formal institutional learning could never provide, the kind of knowledge that existed only at the intersection of theoretical framework and practical application, under conditions that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. Ford's dismissal of conventional educational pathways reflected not arrogance, but hard-won understanding of how inadequate traditional academic training proved when confronted with phenomena that operated beyond the boundaries of earthbound scientific methodology. The 12 doctoral degrees that he had accumulated represented not merely intellectual achievement, but systematic preparation for research that pushed beyond the comfortable limitations of peer-reviewed scholarship into territory where survival depended more on adaptability than credentials. The apprenticeship he offered Dipper was invitation to join this tradition of inquiry that transcended institutional boundaries. Dipper's response to Ford's apprenticeship proposal combined intellectual excitement with emotional conflict that reflected the complex loyalties that had developed during his summer in Gravity Falls. The opportunity to work alongside someone whose knowledge encompassed mysteries that conventional education could never address represented fulfillment of ambitions that Dipper had hardly dared to articulate, yet acceptance would require abandoning relationships and commitments that had become central to his developing sense of identity. The decision demanded not just assessment of career opportunities, but fundamental choices about the kind of person he wanted to become. The alien vessel's automated defense systems activated the moment Ford and Dipper penetrated the craft's outer hull, responding to their presence with weapons technologies that operated according to principles that challenged their understanding of both physics and biology. The energy weapons that emerged from concealed ports throughout the ship's interior were designed to incapacitate rather than kill, suggesting that the craft's original occupants had anticipated the possibility of contact with species whose continued existence might serve some useful purpose. The non-lethal nature of the defensive response provided opportunities for evasion and counterattack that would not have existed against systems designed purely for destruction. Ford's expertise with alien technologies allowed him to identify vulnerable points in the ship's defensive network and develop strategies for disabling key components without triggering more aggressive response protocols. His 3 decades of interdimensional experience had familiarized him with the common principles that governed most spacefaring civilizations' approach to automated security, creating knowledge base that transcended specific technological implementations. The systematic methodology he applied to neutralizing the ship's defenses represented convergence of theoretical understanding with practical experience that few beings in any dimension could match. Dipper's performance during their infiltration of the alien craft exceeded Ford's expectations in ways that confirmed his assessment of the boy's exceptional potential. The combination of analytical thinking and intuitive problem-solving that Dipper demonstrated under pressure suggested intellectual capabilities that transcended mere academic giftedness, indicating the kind of adaptive intelligence that was essential for survival in contexts involving unknown technologies and hostile environments. His ability to identify patterns and solutions that Ford's more systematic approach had overlooked demonstrated the value of fresh perspectives in situations requiring creative innovation. The moment when Ford found himself trapped by the ship's security systems and faced imminent capture by automated restraint devices represented exactly the kind of scenario that his 3 decades of interdimensional experience had prepared him to handle through systematic application of known principles and techniques. Yet Dipper's intervention, motivated by loyalty rather than expertise, succeeded in neutralizing threats that Ford's more sophisticated approach had been unable to counter effectively. The rescue demonstrated not just courage, but the kind of intuitive, tactical thinking that could not be taught through formal instruction. Ford's gratitude for Dipper's intervention was accompanied by recognition that the boy's performance under extreme pressure confirmed every positive assessment of his potential that Ford had made during their brief acquaintance. The intellectual capabilities that Dipper had displayed through academic performance and research methodology were now validated by demonstration of practical competence under conditions that tested every aspect of judgment, character. The combination of traits that Dipper possessed represented exactly the foundation upon which Ford could build the kind of comprehensive education that would prepare someone for responsibilities that transcended normal human experience. The successful recovery of the alien adhesive compound provided immediate solution to the rift containment problem, while simultaneously demonstrating the effectiveness of Ford and Dipper's collaborative approach to complex challenges. Their partnership had achieved results that neither could have accomplished independently, suggesting potential for future cooperation that might address problems far more significant than current crisis management. Ford's growing confidence in Dipper's capabilities was matched by recognition that mentoring such exceptional talent represented both opportunity and responsibility that extended far beyond personal preferences or family obligations. Dipper's acceptance of Ford's apprenticeship offer was motivated by recognition that the opportunity being presented was unprecedented in its scope and significance. Yet his decision was made without adequate consideration of the emotional costs that such acceptance would impose on relationships that had sustained him throughout his most challenging experiences. The intellectual excitement of working with someone whose knowledge encompassed cosmic mysteries was accompanied by unconscious dismissal of bonds that had provided emotional foundation for his developing identity. The apprenticeship represented not just career opportunity, but fundamental choice about values and priorities that would shape the entire trajectory of his future development. Ford's failure to recognize the emotional implications of his apprenticeship proposal reflected patterns of thinking that had characterized his approach to relationships throughout his adult life. His focus on intellectual compatibility and professional potential blinded him to the social and emotional dimensions of human development that were essential for psychological health and personal fulfillment. The same intellectual arrogance that had made him vulnerable to Bill Cipher's manipulation now prevented him from understanding how his offer might affect family dynamics that provided stability and support for everyone involved. Mabel's discovery of the apprenticeship arrangement through accidental eavesdropping created emotional crisis that challenged every assumption about her relationship with Dipper and their shared future beyond the summer in Gravity Falls. The revelation that her twin brother was considering permanent separation from their partnership struck at the fundamental sense of identity that had sustained her through adolescent challenges and family difficulties. The apprenticeship represented not just Dipper's individual opportunity, but potential dissolution of the bond that had defined both their lives since birth. The emotional confrontation between the twins that followed Mabel's discovery of the apprenticeship plan was characterized by the kind of raw pain that emerges when fundamental assumptions about relationships are challenged by circumstances beyond anyone's direct control. Mabel's accusations of betrayal and abandonment met Dipper's defensive explanations of opportunity and necessity, creating conflict that revealed how differently they had interpreted their shared experiences and future possibilities. Neither twin was entirely wrong in their assessment of the situation, yet neither was capable of understanding the other's perspective without sacrificing their own emotional needs. Mabel's vulnerability in the aftermath of her argument with Dipper created exactly the kind of psychological opening that entities like Bill's cipher had learned to exploit across multiple dimensions and countless species. Her isolation and emotional distress made her receptive to approaches that promised solutions to problems that seemed to have no acceptable resolution within normal parameters. The offer of extended summer through manipulation of temporal mechanics addressed her immediate emotional needs while concealing the cosmic costs that such intervention would ultimately exact from everyone involved. The deception that Bill employed to gain Mabel's cooperation drew upon sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the specific emotional vulnerabilities that characterized adolescent development under stress. His appearance as a time traveler, offering magical solutions to temporal problems, exploited both her desperate need for control over circumstances that seemed beyond her influence and her natural inclination to seek creative approaches to difficult challenges. The bargain he proposed seemed to address her concerns without demanding sacrifices that she was unprepared to make. Mabel's decision to surrender the dimensional rift to someone she believed could provide solutions to her family's conflicts was motivated by love rather than selfishness, yet her actions demonstrated how good intentions could be manipulated to serve purposes that operated in direct opposition to everything she claimed to value. The trust she placed in Bill's false persona reflected not stupidity, but the kind of emotional desperation that accompanies recognition that normal approaches to problem solving were inadequate to address the magnitude of challenges confronting her family. The moment when Mabel handed over the dimensional rift represented not just individual choice, but culmination of systematic manipulation that had exploited every vulnerability in the extended Pines family's emotional dynamics. Bill's strategy had required months of careful observation to identify the pressure points that could be used to create conditions favorable to his dimensional invasion, demonstrating the kind of patient intelligence that had allowed him to successfully target multiple civilizations throughout cosmic history. The rift's transfer to his control represented not just tactical victory, but validation of methodologies that had proven effective across countless similar scenarios. Ford's horror upon discovering that the rift had been compromised was accompanied by recognition that his own actions had contributed to creating the conditions that made Mabel vulnerable to Bill's manipulation. His focus on preparing Dipper for cosmic responsibilities had blinded him to the emotional costs that such preparation imposed on family relationships, creating instability that sophisticated enemies could exploit for strategic advantage. The apprenticeship offer that had seemed like generous mentorship was revealed as inadvertent sabotage of the social bonds that provided protection against psychological manipulation. The catastrophic expansion of the dimensional rift upon its activation by Bill's cipher created exactly the kind of reality collapse scenario that Ford had witnessed in multiple other dimensions during his 3 decades of interdimensional exile. The familiar patterns of dimensional decay were accompanied by the terrible knowledge that Earth was following the same predictable path toward complete transformation that had consumed countless other civilizations throughout cosmic history. The weird Mageddon that erupted from the rift's collapse represented not unique catastrophe, but routine expansion of Bill's interdimensional empire into yet another conquered reality. The transformation of Gravity Falls into a nightmare realm where normal physical laws were suspended in favor of chaotic whimsy represented exactly the kind of systematic reality revision that Bill had employed to consolidate control over previous dimensional conquests. The changes were not random, but carefully designed to eliminate resistance possibilities while providing maximum entertainment value for entities whose purposes transcended normal concepts of meaning and mortality. Every aspect of the new reality served Bill's strategic objectives while simultaneously demonstrating his absolute power over environmental conditions that had previously seemed fixed and immutable. Ford's desperate attempts to organize immediate resistance to Bill's dimensional invasion were hampered by the disorientation that accompanied exposure to reality revision on such massive scale. The weapons and defensive technologies that he had accumulated during his interdimensional exile were designed for use under normal physical conditions, their effectiveness compromised by environmental changes that altered fundamental constants governing energy, matter, and causality. The systematic preparation that had sustained him through 3 decades of cosmic warfare proved inadequate against an enemy who possessed the power to rewrite the rules that governed conflict itself. The failure of conventional resistance methods forced Ford to confront the possibility that his intellectual approach to cosmic threats was fundamentally inadequate when facing opponents who possessed the power to alter reality according to their preferences. The careful planning and systematic methodology that had characterized his approach to every challenge since childhood were rendered meaningless by environmental conditions that changed according to no discernible logic beyond the amusement of entities whose purposes operated beyond human comprehension. The humbling recognition that his greatest strengths had become liabilities required psychological adjustment that challenged every assumption about competence and preparation. As you settle towards sleep tonight, recognize how the best intentions can become weapons in the hands of those who understand how to exploit the very love and loyalty that make us human. Ford's failure to consider the emotional implications of his apprenticeship offer created vulnerabilities that cosmic predators were perfectly positioned to exploit, demonstrating how intellectual gifts without emotional wisdom can become sources of danger rather than protection. The catastrophe that emerged from the dimensional rift was not the result of technical failure, but of human failure. To recognize that knowledge and power mean nothing without understanding of the relationships that give life meaning and purpose. The golden prison that contained Stanford Pines during the initial phases of Weirdmageddon was more than mere physical restraint. It was a deliberate humiliation designed to transform one of Earth's most brilliant scientific minds into a decorative object that served Bill Cipher's twisted sense of irony. The molecular transformation that had converted Ford's living tissue into precious metal preserved his consciousness, while rendering him completely immobile, creating a form of torment that combined physical helplessness with full awareness of the cosmic catastrophe unfolding around him. Bill's choice of gold as the medium for Ford's imprisonment was not arbitrary but carefully selected to symbolize the worthlessness of earthbound achievements when measured against interdimensional power. Ford's consciousness during his metallic imprisonment remained fully active, allowing him to observe every detail of Bill's systematic transformation of Gravity Falls from a small logging town into the epicenter of a reality revision project that would eventually encompass the entire planet. The changes he witnessed were not random expressions of chaos, but carefully orchestrated modifications designed to eliminate resistance possibilities while maximizing the entertainment value that Bill extracted from the suffering of conquered populations. Each alteration to the town's physical and social structure served strategic purposes that reflected centuries of experience with dimensional conquest and civilian population management. The parade of interdimensional criminals that Bill had assembled for his invasion of Earth's reality represented a catalogue of entities whose individual capabilities had been sufficient to terrorize entire civilizations across multiple dimensions. 8-Ball's matter manipulation abilities, Kryptos' information warfare expertise, and the being whose name could not be spoken without risking immediate psychic contamination had each earned legendary status among interdimensional travelers who specialized in documenting cosmic threats. Their collective presence in Gravity Falls indicated that Bill's conquest of Earth was not opportunistic expansion, but carefully planned annexation that had required months or years of coordination and recruitment. Teeth's appetite for organic matter had led to the extinction of 17 different species across 4 separate dimensions, while Keyhole's ability to breach any form of physical or metaphysical barrier had made him invaluable for operations requiring access to heavily defended locations. Hectagon's mastery of temporal manipulation had allowed him to trap entire civilizations in recursive time loops that prevented effective resistance while providing endless opportunities for entertainment. The assembled criminals represented not just individual threats, but coordinated capabilities that could overwhelm any defense strategy based on conventional military or scientific principles. Ford's helpless observation of Bill's criminal associates, establishing territorial control over different sections of Gravity Falls, provided him with intelligence about their operational methods and individual vulnerabilities that might prove valuable if he ever regained freedom of action. Each entity's behavior patterns revealed limitations and preferences that reflected their origins in dimensions where different physical laws and evolutionary pressures had shaped their development. The knowledge Ford accumulated during his imprisonment was purchased with psychological torture, yet it represented the only resource he could gather while trapped in his golden form. The transformation of Gravity Falls' human population into components of Bill's entertainment infrastructure demonstrated the systematic efficiency that had characterized his conquest of previous realities. Some residents were converted into decorative elements that served purely aesthetic purposes, their consciousness preserved to ensure maximum suffering while their bodies were reshaped according to Bill's artistic preferences. Others were modified to serve functional roles within the new reality's administrative structure, their personalities altered to ensure absolute loyalty, while their memories remained intact to provide context for their degradation. Bill's treatment of the captured townspeople revealed strategic thinking that operated according to principles that transcended mere sadism or casual cruelty. The psychological profiles he had developed for each resident allowed him to select punishments and modifications that would produce optimal combinations of personal suffering and social disruption. The mayor was transformed into a living statue that retained the ability to speak, but could only repeat official proclamations from his former administrative career, while the police chief was converted into a security system that was programmed to arrest anyone who displayed signs of hope or resistance. The children of Gravity Falls received special attention from Bill's criminal associates, not because of any particular mercy, but because their psychological flexibility made them more suitable for conversion into long-term entertainment resources. Their natural adaptability and creative thinking, normally advantages for survival in changing circumstances, made them particularly valuable for scenarios that required improvisation and unpredictable responses. Several children were selected for inclusion in elaborate games that combined elements of hide-and-seek with existential horror, their terror and confusion providing amusement that could be sustained indefinitely without the risk of permanent psychological collapse. Ford's forced observation of these systematic atrocities was accompanied by the terrible recognition that his own intellectual arrogance had contributed directly to creating the conditions that made Bill's invasion possible. The Portal project that had seemed like the culmination of his scientific career was revealed as merely the preliminary phase of a conquest strategy that had been planned from the moment of their first contact. Bill's manipulation of Ford's academic ambitions and social isolation had been so complete that every decision Ford believed he had made independently had actually served purposes that advanced the dimensional invasion. Timetable, The weeks that Ford spent as a golden ornament in Bill's nightmare realm were characterized by alternating periods of rage and despair, as he was forced to confront the magnitude of his failure, while remaining completely powerless to take corrective action. The brilliant mind that had once solved theoretical problems that challenged the understanding of trained physicists was now trapped in circumstances where intelligence provided no advantage over brute force or supernatural intervention. The systematic humiliation was designed not just to neutralize Ford as a potential threat, but to break his spirit so completely that future resistance would become psychologically impossible. Bill's occasional visits to taunt Ford during his imprisonment revealed the depth of personal animosity that had developed between them since Ford's betrayal of their partnership. The interdimensional demon's comments were crafted with surgical precision to target every source of pride and self-worth that had sustained Ford throughout his academic career and interdimensional exile. Bill's intimate knowledge of Ford's psychological vulnerabilities allowed him to inflict emotional damage that was far more devastating than mere physical torture, creating wounds that would persist long after any bodily injuries had healed. The restoration of Ford's organic form occurred only when Bill's conquest of Gravity Falls was complete enough that additional security measures were no longer necessary for maintaining control over the local population. Ford's return to biological existence was accompanied by immediate transfer to a specially prepared torture chamber, where Bill could conduct the interrogation that would provide him with the mathematical formula necessary for expanding his reality revision beyond the boundaries that currently confined it to a single town. The chamber where Bill conducted Ford's torture was designed according to principles that maximized both physical suffering and psychological pressure, while ensuring that the subject remained conscious and capable of coherent communication throughout the process. The restraint systems incorporated technology that had been perfected through similar operations across multiple dimensions, their effectiveness proven through application to thousands of individuals whose resistance to interrogation had required systematic overcoming. Every aspect of the facility's design reflected Bill's extensive experience with extracting information from subjects who possessed both exceptional willpower and detailed knowledge of potential escape methods. Ford's first experience with Bill's interrogation techniques confirmed his worst fears about the sophistication of the torture protocols that would be applied to break his resistance. The electrical fields that Bill generated were not random applications of pain, but precisely calibrated to stimulate specific nerve clusters in sequences that maximize suffering while avoiding permanent damage that might impair cognitive function. Each shock was timed and positioned according to neurological maps that Bill had developed through systematic experimentation on countless previous subjects across multiple species and dimensional origins. The psychological component of Ford's torture was even more sophisticated than the physical elements, incorporating detailed knowledge of his personal history and emotional vulnerabilities that Bill had accumulated during their years of collaboration. References to Ford's childhood isolation, his guilt over Stanley's banishment, and his responsibility for McGuckett's mental collapse were woven into the interrogation process with surgical precision, creating emotional pressure that was far more devastating than any purely physical coercion. Bill's intimate familiarity with Ford's deepest fears and regrets transformed the torture session into a comprehensive assault on every aspect of his identity and self-worth. Ford's resistance to Bill's torture was based not on physical endurance, but on systematic application of mental disciplines that he had developed during his 3 decades of interdimensional exile. The meditation techniques and consciousness control methods that he had learned from various alien civilizations provided frameworks for maintaining psychological coherence under conditions that would have broken most human minds within hours. His ability to compartmentalize pain, and separate essential knowledge from accessible memory had been honed through experiences with interdimensional predators who specialized in extracting information from unwilling subjects. Bill's offer of partnership during Ford's interrogation was presented with the same seductive charm that had originally convinced Ford to collaborate in the Portal project decades earlier. The interdimensional demon's description of the power and knowledge that Ford could gain through voluntary cooperation was crafted to appeal to the same intellectual vanity that had made Ford vulnerable to manipulation during their scene-end first encounter. Bill's promise of cosmic significance and unlimited access to interdimensional secrets was designed to exploit Ford's deepest psychological needs while concealing the true costs that such partnership would ultimately exact. Ford's rejection of Bill's partnership offer was accompanied by verbal defiance that revealed how completely his perspective on power and achievement had been transformed by his interdimensional experiences. The recognition that knowledge without wisdom was meaningless, and that individual accomplishment meant nothing without connection to something larger than personal ambition, had been purchased through suffering that no earthbound education could provide. His mockery of Bill's claims about power and significance reflected understanding that true strength came not from dominance over others, but from willingness to sacrifice for principles that transcended personal interest. The escalation of torture that followed Ford's continued defiance incorporated techniques that Bill had developed specifically for subjects who possessed exceptional mental discipline and resistance training. The combination of physical agony with systematic psychological assault was designed to overwhelm even the most sophisticated defensive strategies by attacking multiple aspects of consciousness simultaneously. Bill's approach combined direct neural stimulation with manipulation of environmental conditions that made concentration and coherent thought increasingly difficult to maintain, despite Ford's extensive preparation for such scenarios. Ford's ability to maintain silence about the barrier equation, despite hours of sophisticated torture, demonstrated the effectiveness of mental conditioning that had been developed through exposure to some of the most dangerous entities and environments in the interdimensional void. The compartmentalization techniques that allowed him to separate essential information from accessible memory had been refined through repeated exposure to mind-reading technologies and psychic interrogation methods that operated according to principles unknown to earthbound psychology. His resistance was not based on superior willpower alone, but on systematic preparation that had transformed torture resistance into a learnable skill. The rescue operation that ultimately freed Ford from Bill's torture chamber was coordinated by the same family members and townspeople whose capabilities he had consistently underestimated throughout his scientific career. The strategies they employed drew not on advanced theoretical knowledge, but on practical understanding of local conditions and improvised solutions to problems that conventional military doctrine had never addressed. Their success demonstrated that effective resistance to cosmic threats required not just individual brilliance, but collaborative effort that combined diverse perspectives and complementary capabilities. Stanley's leadership during the rescue operation reflected personal transformation that had occurred during his 3 decades of portal research and operation. The brother who had once been dismissed as intellectually inferior had developed strategic thinking and tactical planning abilities that proved essential for coordinating complex operations under extreme pressure. His natural charisma and ability to inspire confidence in others had been refined through years of experience with crisis management that formal education could never provide. Dipper and Mabel's contributions to the rescue effort demonstrated how their summer of supernatural encounters had prepared them for challenges that would have overwhelmed most adults with conventional life experience. Their adaptation to reality revision conditions and their intuitive understanding of how Bill's power operated had given them capabilities that were unavailable to individuals who relied purely on rational analysis or systematic methodology. The combination of youthful flexibility with accumulated practical knowledge made them uniquely effective against opponents whose strength lay in exploiting conventional assumptions about how conflict should be conducted. The townspeople's participation in Ford's rescue revealed community resources and individual capabilities that had remained hidden during normal circumstances, but became essential when conventional authority structures were no longer functional. Their knowledge of local terrain and social dynamics provided tactical advantages that no amount of external expertise could have supplied, while their personal investment in protecting their home gave them motivation that mercenary forces could never match. Ford's restoration to biological form and subsequent integration into the resistance movement was accompanied by recognition that his intellectual approach to problem-solving was valuable but insufficient for addressing threats that operated according to principles that transcended rational analysis. The systematic methodology that had characterized his approach to every challenge since childhood required supplementation with intuitive thinking and collaborative strategies that drew upon resources beyond his individual knowledge experience. The revelation of the Zodiac ritual as a potential solution to the Bill Cipher crisis represented convergence of Ford's academic research with indigenous knowledge systems that he had previously dismissed as primitive. Superstition, the ancient prophecy that described a ceremonial circle capable of containing interdimensional entities, had been preserved in oral traditions that operated according to principles completely different from written academic discourse. The effectiveness of such knowledge systems, despite their lack of peer review or institutional validation, challenged fundamental assumptions about how truth could be identified and preserved across generations. The assembly of individuals whose personal symbols corresponded to elements within the zodiac wheel required coordination between people whose normal social interactions were characterized by conflict and mutual distrust. The ritual's effectiveness depended not on individual capabilities, but on collective cooperation that transcended personal animosities and competing interests. The requirement for unity among participants whose relationships had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and accumulated grievances represented a challenge that was more complex than any technical problem Ford had previously encountered. Ford's argument with Stanley during the crucial moments of the Zodiac ritual demonstrated how personal conflicts could undermine collective efforts to address existential threats regardless of the stakes involved. The same patterns of communication breakdown that had characterized their relationship since childhood reasserted themselves at precisely the moment when cooperation was most essential for planetary survival. Their inability to set aside personal grievances in favor of larger purposes revealed how psychological limitations could become more dangerous than any external threat. The failure of the Zodiac ritual, due to interpersonal conflict among the participants, represented a tragic illustration of how human nature itself could become humanity's greatest vulnerability when confronting threats that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and mutual trust. The ritual's collapse was not caused by technical inadequacy or insufficient power, but by the fundamental inability of damaged relationships to sustain the kind of unity that the ceremony required for successful completion. Ford's capture alongside Stanley following the ritual's failure provided Bill with exactly the leverage he had been seeking to extract the barrier equation through psychological pressure rather than physical torture. The threat to harm Stanley created emotional vulnerability that Ford had not experienced during his solitary interrogation, demonstrating how attachment to others could become a source of weakness when confronting opponents who were willing to exploit any available advantage. Bill's strategy of targeting emotional bonds rather than individual resistance revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the social nature of human motivation. The deception that allowed Stanley to appear as the target of Bill's final assault while Ford pretended to surrender represented perhaps the most successful collaborative strategy the twins had ever attempted. Their ability to coordinate complex deception under extreme pressure demonstrated how their complementary capabilities could achieve results that neither could have accomplished independently. Stanley's willingness to sacrifice his memories to destroy Bill required exactly the kind of selfless courage that Ford had never fully appreciated, despite decades of evidence regarding his brother's fundamental decency. Ford's operation of the memory gun to erase Bill from Stanley's consciousness represented the convergence of theoretical knowledge with practical application under circumstances that allowed for no margin of error or second attempts. The device's successful activation required precise technical understanding combined with emotional commitment to a course of action that guaranteed devastating personal loss regardless of its effectiveness against the intended target. The moment of Bill's destruction was achieved not through superior force or advanced technology, but through willingness to sacrifice what was most precious for the sake of others, who would never fully understand the magnitude of what had been lost. The aftermath of Bill's destruction left Ford confronting the terrible recognition that victory over cosmic evil had been purchased through the loss of his brother's personality and memories, creating a form of grief that was more complex than simple death, because it involved continued physical presence combined with complete psychological absence. Stanley's survival, in biological terms, was accompanied by the disappearance of everything that had made him uniquely himself, leaving Ford to mourn someone who remained physically present but was psychologically gone forever. Ford's guilt over Stanley's sacrifice was intensified by recognition that the memory erasure had eliminated not just recent experiences, but the accumulated wisdom and personal growth that Stanley had achieved during his 3 decades of portal research and operation. The brother who had transformed himself from failed con artist into competent interdimensional engineer was gone, replaced by someone who retained none of the knowledge or capabilities that had made his contributions to planetary defense so valuable. The victory over Bill had been achieved at a cost that made celebration impossible despite its cosmic significance. The gradual recovery of Stanley's memories, through exposure to familiar experiences and relationships, provided Ford with hope that the sacrifice might not be permanent. Yet each recovered fragment served as reminder of how much had been lost and how uncertain the restoration process remained. Stanley's personality began to reassemble itself through interactions with people and places that had been significant in his life. But the process was unpredictable and incomplete, leaving gaps that might never be filled regardless of how much effort was devoted to memory recovery. Ford's recognition that love and loyalty had triumphed over intellectual analysis in the final confrontation with Bill Cipher represented fundamental revision of everything he had believed about the nature of strength and the sources of power that could be relied upon when facing existential threats. The systematic preparation and theoretical knowledge that had sustained him through 3 decades of interdimensional exile had proven less valuable than the willingness of family members to sacrifice themselves for each other despite decades of accumulated grievances and mutual misunderstanding. As you drift towards sleep tonight, recognize that the greatest victories are often purchased through sacrifices that transform triumph into bittersweet acknowledgement of what was lost in service of what was saved. Ford's defeat of Bill Cipher was achieved not through superior knowledge or advanced technology, but through recognition that some things are worth any price, including the loss of those we love most. The cosmic horror that threatened to consume all reality, was overcome by the simple human willingness to choose others' welfare over personal survival, demonstrating that love remains the most powerful force in any universe regardless of the sophistication of the threats arrayed against it. The silence that descended over Gravity Falls in the aftermath of Bill Cipher's destruction was not the peaceful quiet of a crisis resolved, but rather the hollow emptiness that accompanies victory purchased at costs too terrible to fully comprehend. Stanford Pines stood amid the wreckage of a town that had been transformed into a nightmare realm and then restored to something resembling normalcy, yet he found himself unable to feel the satisfaction that should have accompanied such an unprecedented triumph over cosmic evil. The interdimensional tyrant who had threatened to consume all reality was gone forever, erased from existence by the combined sacrifice of human love and scientific precision. But the price of that victory had left wounds in Ford's soul that no amount of time or achievement could ever fully heal. The gradual restoration of Gravity Falls' normal physical laws and environmental conditions proceeded according to predictable patterns that Ford recognized from his observations of similar dimensional collapses during his 3 decades of interdimensional exile. The reality revision effects that had transformed the town into Bill's personal playground were dissipating at rates that could be calculated using mathematical models Ford had developed through direct experience with multiple such scenarios. Yet, unlike the previous instances he had witnessed, this dimensional restoration was not accompanied by the total destruction of the affected population, creating an unprecedented scenario that challenged every assumption about how such recoveries should unfold. The townspeople who had survived Bill's reign of terror emerged from their various transformations and imprisonments bearing psychological scars that would require years of careful healing to address adequately. Many retained fragmentary memories of their experiences during Weirdmageddon, creating trauma responses that conventional psychological treatment was completely unprepared to handle. The children who had been selected for Bill's entertainment had been exposed to forms of existential horror that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality, safety, and the nature of existence itself. Ford's role in coordinating the town's recovery efforts was complicated by his recognition that his scientific expertise was largely irrelevant to the kinds of healing that the community most urgently needed. The theoretical frameworks and systematic methodologies that had sustained him through decades of cosmic challenges provided little guidance for addressing the emotional devastation that accompanied survival of interdimensional warfare. His attempts to organize rational responses to irrational trauma were hampered by his own limited understanding of how communities process collective suffering and gradually rebuild social structures that had been systematically destroyed. The mystery shack that had served as sanctuary during the final phases of the crisis was gradually restored to its previous function as tourist attraction and family gathering place. Yet the building's transformation could not erase the memories of what had occurred within its walls during those crucial hours when the fate of reality itself had hung in the balance. Every room contained reminders of decisions made under pressure that had determined not just personal survival but the continued existence of entire dimensions. The ordinary commercial activities that resumed in the building's public spaces were shadowed by knowledge of the cosmic significance that the location had possessed during humanity's darkest hour. Stanley's memory recovery process provided Ford with hope that was constantly tempered by recognition of how much had been permanently lost, despite the gradual return of familiar personality traits and behavioral patterns. Each recovered fragment of Stanley's identity served as both celebration and mourning, acknowledging what had been restored while highlighting the vast expanses of experience and knowledge that remained missing and might never be recovered, regardless of how much effort was devoted to the restoration process. The relationship between the twins during Stanley's recovery period was characterized by a complex mixture of gratitude, guilt, and tentative rediscovery of bonds that had been damaged by decades of separation and misunderstanding. Ford's attempts to help Stanley remember their shared experiences were complicated by his own uncertainty about which memories would be beneficial and which might prove traumatic or overwhelming. The process of rebuilding their partnership required not just recovery of lost information, but active reconstruction of trust and communication patterns that had been disrupted by years of accumulated grievances. Ford's interactions with Dipper and Mabel during the post-crisis period were marked by his growing recognition that their contributions to Bill's defeat had been based not on academic knowledge or systematic preparation, but on intuitive understanding of principles that formal education could never adequately address. Their approaches to problem-solving combined creativity with compassion in ways that had proven more effective against cosmic threats than any amount of theoretical expertise or technological sophistication. The journals that had begun as scientific documentation of Gravity Falls' anomalous phenomena had evolved into historical records of humanity's first successful resistance to interdimensional conquest, their pages containing knowledge that would be essential for future generations who might face similar challenges. Ford's decision to preserve and protect these documents was motivated by recognition that the information they contained represented not just personal research, but collective achievement that transcended individual accomplishment. The underground laboratory that had witnessed the creation and destruction of the portal was gradually converted from active research facility into memorial and archive. Its equipment, preserved not for continued use, but as testament to the prices that had been paid for cosmic knowledge and the dangers that accompanied unrestrained pursuit of theoretical understanding. The space served as permanent reminder of how intellectual ambition without emotional wisdom could become pathway to catastrophe rather than achievement. Ford's adjustment to life in a world where existential threats had been eliminated required psychological adaptation that was more challenging than any technical problem he had previously encountered. The hypervigilant awareness that had sustained him through decades of survival in hostile environments was no longer necessary or appropriate. Yet the mental habits formed through such experiences could not be easily abandoned. His gradual transition from survival mode to normal social functioning required conscious effort and systematic desensitization to environmental stimuli that had previously indicated immediate danger. The academic recognition that eventually came to Ford for his role in planetary defense was received with complex emotions that reflected his evolving understanding of what constituted genuine achievement and meaningful contribution to human welfare. The honors and accolades that would have thrilled him during his youth now seemed less significant than the relationships he had nearly sacrificed in pursuit of individual glory. His perspective on success had been fundamentally altered by experiences that had taught him to value collaboration over competition and connection over recognition. Ford's decision to abandon his systematic study of Gravity Falls' remaining anomalous phenomena was motivated not by loss of intellectual curiosity, but by recognition that some forms of knowledge were too dangerous to pursue without compelling necessity. The town's supernatural characteristics would continue to attract researchers and investigators, but Ford's participation in such activities would require extraordinary justification given his understanding of how quickly academic inquiry could escalate into existential threat. The gradual integration of Ford back into normal human society was facilitated by family relationships that provided both motivation and structure for the psychological adjustments that such integration required. His growing appreciation for the emotional intelligence that had sustained his family through the cosmic crisis was accompanied by recognition that his previous dismissal of such capabilities had been based on intellectual arrogance rather than rational assessment of their practical value. The letters that Ford began exchanging with surviving members of civilizations he had encountered during his interdimensional exile served multiple purposes, maintaining connections that had been forged through shared experiences, while providing ongoing intelligence about potential threats that might emerge from other dimensions. These communications represented Ford's attempt to balance his withdrawal from active research with continued responsibility for protecting his world from dangers that ordinary security agencies were unprepared to recognize or address. Ford's writing projects during this period focused not on advancing scientific knowledge, but on preserving hard-won wisdom about the relationship between intellectual capability and moral responsibility. His memoirs were intended not as autobiography, but as warning and guidance for future generations who might face choices similar to those that had shaped his own development. The audience he envisioned for such work consisted not of academic colleagues, but of individuals who might possess the intellectual gifts and character flaws that had made him vulnerable to cosmic manipulation. The speaking engagements that Ford occasionally accepted were carefully selected to address audiences whose work might bring them into contact with phenomena that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding. His presentations emphasized not the technical details of interdimensional physics, but the psychological and ethical dimensions of research that pushed beyond normal human experience. The warnings he provided were based not on theoretical analysis, but on direct knowledge of how curiosity could become pathway to corruption when divorced from wisdom and human connection. Ford's mentoring of young researchers was conducted with systematic attention to identifying and addressing the personality characteristics that had made him vulnerable to Bill Cipher's manipulation decades earlier. His approach emphasized not just technical competence, but emotional intelligence and ethical reflection as essential components of advanced scientific education. The students he selected for such guidance were chosen not primarily for their intellectual capabilities, but for their demonstrated capacity for collaborative thinking and concern for consequences that extended beyond personal achievement. The philanthropic activities that gradually consumed increasing portions of Ford's time and resources were focused on supporting educational programs that emphasized critical thinking and ethical reasoning as integral components of scientific literacy. His contributions were designed not to advance specific research agendas, but to promote approaches to education that would reduce the likelihood of future generations repeating the mistakes that had nearly resulted in planetary destruction. Ford's relationship with Stanley during the later phases of memory recovery was characterized by mutual recognition that their partnership had always been more valuable than either individual achievement or personal recognition. The competitive dynamics that had characterized their childhood and young adulthood were gradually replaced by collaborative approaches that drew upon their complementary strengths while acknowledging their individual limitations and vulnerabilities. The decision to undertake global exploration aboard the Stan O-2 represented not escape from responsibility but conscious choice to pursue adventure and discovery within ethical parameters that honored both their relationship and their obligations to the larger human community. The vessel that carried them away from Gravity Falls had been designed and equipped according to principles that balanced their desire for exploration with recognition of their duty to avoid creating new dangers for worlds and civilizations they might encounter during their travels. The ship that bore the twins away from Gravity Falls carried with it not just the accumulated experience of their individual journeys, but the hard-won wisdom that had emerged from their collaborative triumph over cosmic evil. Their departure was marked not by abandonment of responsibility, but by recognition that their service to humanity could best be continued through different forms of contribution that drew upon their unique capabilities while avoiding the kinds of risks that their previous activities had created. Ford's final entries in his research journals were devoted not to documenting new discoveries, but to reflecting on the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, individual achievement and collective welfare, intellectual ambition, and emotional understanding. His conclusions emphasized that the most profound truths about existence could not be discovered through systematic investigation, but only experienced through relationships that transcended personal interest and individual survival. The legacy that Ford and Stanley left behind in Gravity Falls was not contained in their scientific research or technical achievements, but in the demonstration that love and loyalty could triumph over forces that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. Their story became part of the town's oral tradition, preserved not through academic publication but through the kind of community memory that had sustained indigenous warnings about Bill Cipher across generations before written documentation existed. As the Stano War II disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying the Pines twins toward adventures that would be measured not by their contributions to human knowledge but by their commitment to each other and their shared values, Ford's understanding of his life's meaning had been fundamentally transformed by experiences that no amount of formal education could have provided. The scholar who had once sought to unlock the universe's secrets through systematic investigation had discovered that the most profound mysteries were not solved through observation and analysis, but lived through connection and service to purposes larger than personal achievement. The quiet that settled over Gravity Falls in the wake of their departure was not the silence of abandonment, but the peace that comes when cosmic threats have been neutralized through sacrifice that honored the best aspects of human nature, while acknowledging the dangers that accompany unrestrained pursuit of power and knowledge. Ford's journals remained as testament to both the wonders and terrors that existed beyond normal human experience, their pages serving as permanent reminder that wisdom consists not in knowing everything, but in understanding what should remain unknown for the sake of those we love and the world we share. The dust settles on Gravity Falls, and Ford faces a world forever changed. Bill Cipher is gone, the interdimensional rift sealed, but the cost has been immeasurable. Yet from this devastation emerges something Ford never expected: true understanding of what matters most. No longer the arrogant scholar who once dismissed his brother's worth, Ford extends the invitation that should have come decades earlier. The conversation that led to their departure aboard the Stano War II was conducted with the kind of careful attention to unspoken meanings that had characterized the most significant moments of their relationship throughout childhood and adolescence. Ford's words were chosen not just for their immediate content, but for their acknowledgement of everything that had been left unsaid during the 30 years of their separation. The accumulated weight of missed opportunities for connection and mutual understanding that had finally been resolved through shared experience of cosmic crisis and personal sacrifice. Stanley, Ford said, his voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned through bitter experience that intellectual achievement meant nothing without someone to share it with. I've spent my entire adult life pursuing knowledge and discovery, convinced that understanding the universe's secrets would somehow justify all the relationships I'd abandoned in service of that goal. But I realize now that I've been approaching the question from entirely the wrong direction. Stanley's response was characteristic of someone whose 3 decades of devoted effort to rescue his brother had been motivated not by expectation of gratitude, but by the simple recognition that family bonds transcended individual accomplishment or personal recognition. Ford, I ain't gonna pretend I understood half of what you were dealing with during all those years, but I knew one thing for sure. Brothers don't abandon each other, no matter how complicated things get or how long it takes to figure out the right way to help. The vessel that would carry them into their new phase of shared adventure had been designed and constructed according to principles that balanced their individual interests with their mutual commitment to avoiding the kinds of risks that had characterized Ford's previous research activities. The Stan War II incorporated safety systems and communication equipment that would allow them to maintain contact with terrestrial authorities while exploring regions and phenomena that conventional maritime vessels were not equipped to investigate safely. Ford's contribution to the ship's design reflected his 3 decades of experience with environments that operated according to physical laws different from those governing normal earthbound experience. The modifications he had implemented drew upon technologies and methodologies he had acquired during his interdimensional exile, adapted for use within terrestrial parameters that would not attract unwanted attention from entities or agencies whose interest might prove problematic for global security. Stanley's role in the vessel's construction and outfitting demonstrated the practical engineering capabilities that he had developed during his years of portal research and operation. His approach to problem-solving combined intuitive understanding of mechanical systems with accumulated knowledge about how theoretical designs translated into functional hardware under real-world conditions. The ship that emerged from their collaboration represented synthesis of Ford's theoretical expertise with Stanley's practical experience, creating capabilities that neither could have achieved independently. The departure ceremony that marked their exit from Gravity Falls was deliberately modest, reflecting their shared recognition that public attention would complicate their ability to pursue the kinds of investigations and explorations that their future activities would require. The townspeople who gathered to witness their departure understood that the twins' contributions to planetary defense created obligations and opportunities that transcended normal retirement expectations. Yet their leaving was marked more by gratitude than celebration. Dipper and Mabel's reactions to their great-uncle's departure combined sadness at the end of their shared adventures, with recognition that the relationship they had developed during their summer in Gravity Falls had prepared them for challenges and opportunities that would shape their entire future development. The lessons they had learned about courage, loyalty, and the importance of family bonds would influence every significant decision they made throughout their lives, creating legacy that extended far beyond the immediate impact of Ford and Stanley's departure. The first weeks aboard the Stan War II were characterized by gradual adjustment to living conditions that required constant cooperation and mutual accommodation in ways that their previous relationship had never demanded. The confined space and shared responsibilities created opportunities for the kinds of extended conversation and collaborative problem-solving that had been impossible during their brief reunion in Gravity Falls. Their partnership evolved from theoretical concept into practical reality through daily experience of working together toward common goals. Ford's adaptation to life aboard the vessel required systematic modification of mental habits and behavioral patterns that had been shaped by decades of solitary research and hypervigilant awareness of potential threats. The relaxation of constant defensive posture was perhaps more challenging than any technical problem he had previously encountered, requiring conscious effort to accept that his environment was genuinely safe and that his survival no longer depended on individual vigilance against cosmic dangers. Stanley's approach to their shared maritime adventures was characterized by the same practical optimism that had sustained him through his most difficult years as small-time criminal and con artist. His ability to find humor and possibility in challenging circumstances provided emotional balance that complemented Ford's tendency towards serious analysis and systematic preparation. Their different approaches to uncertainty and risk created synergy that enhanced their effectiveness in situations requiring both careful planning and flexible response to unexpected developments. The destinations they selected for their exploration were chosen through collaborative process that balanced Ford's scientific interests with Stanley's preference for locations that offered opportunities for the kinds of adventure and discovery that had characterized their childhood dreams. Their itinerary included both sites of genuine research significance and places that simply promised interesting experiences and beautiful scenery, reflecting their mutual recognition that their journey's value would be measured not just by its contributions to human knowledge, but by its success in strengthening their relationship. The communications they maintained with family members back in California and Oregon served multiple purposes, providing ongoing connection to the relationships that had become central to their sense of identity, while sharing experiences and insights that enriched the lives of people who had supported them through their most challenging periods. Their letters and occasional phone calls were characterized by the kind of detailed attention to emotional content that had been absent from their relationship during earlier phases of their lives. Ford's research activities during their maritime travels were conducted according to ethical parameters that had been established through painful experience with the consequences of unrestrained scientific inquiry. His investigations focused on phenomena that posed no risk of dimensional destabilization or cosmic threat escalation, emphasizing documentation and understanding rather than experimentation or manipulation. The knowledge he accumulated was shared with appropriate academic and governmental institutions through carefully managed channels that prevented unauthorized access to potentially dangerous information. Stanley's contributions to their research efforts drew upon observational skills and practical problem-solving abilities that complemented Ford's theoretical approach without duplicating or competing with his brother's areas of expertise. His natural ability to connect with people from diverse cultural backgrounds provided access to local knowledge and traditional wisdom that formal academic research methods often overlooked or dismissed. The information they gathered through Stanley's social connections frequently proved more valuable than data obtained through systematic scientific methodology. The maritime adventures that occupied their time between research activities rekindled the spirit of shared exploration and discovery that had characterized their childhood partnership before academic achievement and social pressure had driven wedge between their interests and priorities. Their collaboration aboard the Stan War II demonstrated how their different strengths could enhance rather than compete with each other when directed toward common goals that honored both individual talents and mutual affection. The storms they weathered together, both meteorological and interpersonal, served to strengthen their partnership through shared experience of overcoming challenges that required both technical competence and emotional resilience. Ford's systematic approach to crisis management was balanced by Stanley's intuitive response to rapidly changing conditions, creating collaborative effectiveness that exceeded what either could have achieved independently. The ports they visited provided opportunities for interaction with communities and cultures that operated according to values and priorities different from those that had shaped their American upbringing and academic experience. These encounters expanded their understanding of human diversity and cultural adaptation, while reinforcing their appreciation for the family bonds that had sustained them through their most difficult periods. The specimens and artifacts they collected during their travels were preserved and documented according to protocols that ensured their scientific value, while preventing accidental exposure to potentially hazardous properties. Ford's experience with anomalous phenomena had taught him to approach unfamiliar materials with systematic caution that balanced research opportunities with safety considerations for both themselves and the larger human community. Ford's gradual healing from the psychological trauma of his interdimensional exile was facilitated by the kind of consistent human companionship and emotional support that no amount of individual effort could have provided. Stanley's presence served as constant reminder that survival and achievement were meaningless without connection to relationships that transcended personal interest and individual accomplishment. The conversations they shared during quiet evening hours aboard their vessel addressed decades of accumulated pain and misunderstanding with patience and compassion that gradually transformed old wounds into sources of strength. Stanley's recovery of memories lost during the final confrontation with Bill Cipher was accelerated by constant exposure to shared experiences and collaborative activities that triggered recollection of personality patterns and behavioral preferences that had been temporarily erased but not permanently destroyed. Each recovered fragment of his identity was celebrated through acknowledgement and integration that strengthened both his individual sense of self and their mutual understanding of how their partnership could continue to evolve and develop. The legacy they created through their shared adventures extended far beyond their individual contributions to scientific knowledge or maritime exploration. Their demonstration that damaged relationships could be healed through patience, forgiveness, and mutual commitment to growth provided inspiration and guidance for other families struggling with similar challenges. The example they set through their commitment to each other, despite decades of separation and misunderstanding, became part of the larger story of human resilience and the power of love to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Their final years together were marked not by dramatic adventures or cosmic crises, but by the quiet satisfaction of partnership that had been tested by extraordinary circumstances and proven strong enough to sustain them through whatever challenges their future might hold. The Stan-O War II carried them toward horizons that represented not escape from responsibility but fulfillment of purposes that honored both their individual gifts and their commitment to each other and the larger human community they had served through their triumph over interdimensional evil. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, rest in the knowledge that the greatest adventures are not measured by the distance traveled or the dangers overcome, but by the depth of connection forged between souls who have chosen to share their journey despite every obstacle and challenge that life places in their path. Ford's transformation from isolated scholar to devoted brother represents the eternal possibility of redemption through love, demonstrating that no mistake is too great and no separation too long to prevent the healing that comes when human beings choose connection over competition, collaboration over individual achievement, and love over fear of vulnerability and loss.